Walter Crowe snatched the map out of Clara Whitmore's hands before she could even finish her sentence. He held it up to the lantern light, turned it once, twice, then let it drop onto the counter like it was something he'd scraped off the bottom of his boot. "You walked all the way into town," he said, not even looking at her, "to show me this?" Clara reached for it. He slid it further away with one finger. "Your husband spent his last years chasing ghost trails and frozen cliffs instead of fixing that roof I can see from the road." He finally looked at her. Not at her face, but through her, the way men looked at things they'd already decided didn't matter. "And now you want my wagon, my horses, my supplies." He picked up the map again, waved it once in the air so the three men standing behind her could see. "For this." Someone laughed. Clara didn't turn around to see who. She was 31 years old, standing in a trading post that smelled like tobacco and wet wool, wearing her dead husband's coat because hers had torn at the shoulder last February and she hadn't had money to fix it. Her children were at home. The roof was failing. The storm coming down from the north was the kind people in Black Hollow Crossing only spoke about in past tense, because the ones who lived through it were the only ones left to describe it. And Walter Crowe was waving her husband's map in the air like it was a joke. "Give it back," she said. He set it on the counter. Take it and go home, Mrs. Whitmore. Grieve properly. Sell what you can before spring. That's the only map worth following now. If you've ever been told that the thing you believed in most was worthless, if you've ever stood in a room full of people who'd already decided you couldn't do something, then you know exactly what Clara felt in that moment. Not rage, not tears, something quieter and far more dangerous than either. She picked up the map, folded it carefully along the same creases Elias had made, and walked out without another word. Before we go any further, if this kind of story speaks to you, if you believe that the people everyone underestimates are sometimes the ones who survive what everyone else cannot, hit that subscribe button right now and stay with us until the end. Drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit the like button. And don't go anywhere, because what Clara finds before this winter is over will change everything you think you know about strength. The cold hit her the moment she stepped outside, and it was the kind of cold that had opinions about you. It pressed against her face and found the gap at her collar and moved through the coat like it was looking for something soft to ruin. Clara Whitmore walked the half-mile back to her homestead without stopping. She had learned not to cry in public 2 years before Elias died, during a dry summer when they'd lost most of their crop and had to ask the bank in Callan Ridge for an extension. The man behind the desk had been polite enough, but she had seen the look he exchanged with his clerk when he thought she wasn't watching. The quick sideways look that said these people are already finished. They just don't know it yet. She had cried in the wagon on the way home, with Elias driving and saying nothing because he knew she needed the silence. And she had decided somewhere between the bank and their front gate that she would not let men who underestimated her see that it hurt. It still hurt. She had just gotten better at keeping it inside, where it could be useful instead of visible. The homestead sat at the edge of a long, flat field that backed up against a line of scrub pine. From a distance, it looked almost manageable. Closer, you saw the truth of it. The sag in the roof where the snow load had warped the beam last March, the fence line that ran straight for 60 yards, and then gave up and leaned sideways like a man who'd had too much to drink. The barn door held shut with a piece of rope because the original latch had broken in November, and there hadn't been a spare moment or a spare cent to replace it. Elias had been the kind of man who always had 3 projects going and none of them quite finished. She used to tease him about it. Now she understood it differently. He had been building something. He just hadn't had enough time. She pushed through the front door and found Thomas at the table, trying to resole his boot with a strip of leather and a look of intense concentration that reminded her so painfully of his father that she had to stop and breathe for a moment before speaking. He was 12, old enough to understand most of what was happening, not old enough to carry it without showing the weight. "Well?" he said without looking up. Crowe said no. Thomas set down the leather. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "Did he look at the map?" "He looked at it." "And he still said no." "He said your father was chasing ghost trails." Thomas picked up the leather again. "Crowe's never been further west than the mill pond," he said, and there was something in his voice that was trying hard to be even. "He wouldn't know a ghost trail from a surveyor's line." Clara set the map on the table and hung up the coat. "Where's your sister?" Checking the chickens. She said the small one looked wrong this morning. The small one always looks wrong. That's what I told her. From the back of the house, Molly's voice carried through the thin wall. I can hear you both, and she does look wrong, and I'm not wrong about it. Molly was 9. She had her father's stubbornness and her mother's ability to notice things no one else noticed, and the combination of those two traits made her either extremely useful or extremely difficult, depending on the day. Today, Clara was counting on useful. She spread the map on the table. Thomas leaned over without being asked. The map was drawn on the back of a surveyor's sheet. Elias had always said it came from a government survey party that had camped near their land back in the late 70s, before the homestead era, when this part of the territory was still mostly trappers and cattle drives. The front side had official measurements and elevation lines. The back side had Elias's handwriting, which was careful and small and nothing at all like the man, who had taken up a lot of space in a room. Clara had looked at the map perhaps 40 times since Elias died. She had looked at it the way you look at something you're afraid to understand too quickly, because once you understand it, you have to decide what to do about it. Tonight was the night she let herself understand it. The iron marker was the key. She had known that since she found it tucked inside the cover of Elias's old survey journal, wrapped in oilskin to keep out the moisture, sitting next to a note that said only, "When the time comes, you'll know." She had not known. Not at first. She had spent 3 weeks after his death just trying to keep the children fed and the animals alive, and the marker had sat on the shelf above the fireplace like an accusation she wasn't ready to face. It was roughly the size of a large man's fist, cast iron, with a series of notches cut along one edge that didn't match any lock she'd ever seen and didn't look decorative enough to be purely ornamental. Thomas reached out and touched the edge of the map. "The Western Cliffs," he said. He always talked about the Western Cliffs. "I know." He said the limestone there did something strange with the water, that it filtered down through the rock and came out different on the other side. "He told you that?" Thomas nodded. "Last winter, when we were checking the fence line on the north side. He got quiet for a while, and then he said, 'The cliffs know something we don't. Someday we'll go look.'" He paused. "I thought he meant in the spring." Clara looked at her son's face and saw the thing he was trying not to show her. The particular grief of a boy who had been promised a future that arrived without the person who was supposed to share it. She reached over and covered his hand with hers for exactly 3 seconds. Long enough to mean something, not so long that it made him feel like he needed to cry in front of her. "He meant now," she said. "I think he meant now all along." The storm changed everything about the timeline. By the following morning, the sky had turned the specific shade of gray that old-timers in the territory described as wolf light. Not quite dark, not quite bright, the color of something waiting for permission to do damage. The temperature had dropped 12 degrees overnight. The wind had picked up from the northwest, carrying the smell of the high country, which meant the storm wasn't just coming down the plains, it was coming over the mountains. Gideon Marsh stopped by while Clara was repairing the sled. He was the closest thing Black Hollow Crossing had to a voice of practical authority, not because anyone had given him the title, but because he had lived through 3 bad winters and 3 bad droughts, and had the kind of quiet confidence that came from surviving things rather than just knowing about them. He was also the only person in town who had been genuinely kind to Elias, and by extension, to Clara, which is why she listened when he knocked on the fence post and waited for her to acknowledge him. "Storm's going to be the worst in 20 years, he said. He didn't bother with a greeting. Neither did she. "I know. Your roof won't hold." "I know that too." He looked at the sled, at the harness she was modifying, at the stack of supplies she'd pulled from the back of the barn. Not all of them, just the ones she could carry without needing a wagon. He was a man who noticed things and drew conclusions quietly, and she watched him doing it now. "You're not leaving for Callan Ridge," he said. "No." "You're going west." "Yes." He was quiet for a long moment. The wind pushed between them, and Clara's hair came loose on one side, but she didn't bother fixing it because her hands were full of harness leather. "Clara." He said it carefully, the way you say someone's name when you want them to know you're about to disagree with them, but you respect them too much to do it carelessly. "I've been on this frontier for 30 years. I've seen men stronger than either of us underestimate what that country does to a person in winter, and I've helped bury some of them in the spring. I'm aware. The children are coming with me. He stopped. You can't take the children into that. I can't leave them here. She set down the harness and looked at him directly. If the roof goes in the storm, there's nothing to come back to. If I go west and find what Elias built, there's shelter, warmth, supplies. He told me enough to know it exists, Gideon. I just have to get there first. If it exists, it exists. The certainty in her voice was not the certainty of someone who had all the information. It was the certainty of someone who had chosen to trust the person they loved most in the world, even after he was gone. It was a different kind of confidence, less about knowing and more about deciding, and it was absolutely unshakable. Gideon Marsh looked at her for a long time. Then he sighed through his nose, not in defeat exactly, but in the way a man sighs when he recognizes he's watching someone do something they cannot be stopped from doing. Then let me help you with the rigging, he said. They worked for 2 hours in the cold, the wind picking up steadily as they went. He didn't ask her again to reconsider. She didn't offer any further explanations. They just worked, which was the way Clara preferred things, doing rather than discussing, moving rather than waiting. Thomas helped with the loading. Molly, who had been watching from the barn doorway for most of the morning, finally came out and walked directly to where the iron marker sat wrapped in cloth on top of the supply bundle. "Can I see it?" she asked. Clara nodded. Molly unwrapped it with the same careful attention she gave to everything she cared about, slow and deliberate, not rushing the reveal. She held it up and turned it in the flat gray light. The notches along one edge caught the light in a way that made them look less random than they usually did. "It's not a key," Molly said. "No. It's part of something bigger, like it only works when it's touching the thing it belongs to." Clara looked at her daughter. "How do you figure that?" Molly turned the marker again. "Because the notches are too regular to be for a single mechanism. They're a sequence. You'd need a receiver with matching intervals, something built into a surface." Gideon Marsh had stopped working and was staring at the 9-year-old. Thomas looked moderately offended. "I was going to say that." "You weren't," Molly said pleasantly, and rewrapped the marker. They were ready by early afternoon, which was later than Clara had wanted and earlier than she had feared. The sled held their essentials, food for 5 days, extra clothing rolled tight, the rifle and 2 boxes of cartridges, a small axe, rope, the water vessels, and the map inside the oilskin wrapper that Elias had used. Ranger, who was technically not their dog, but had been living in their barn since he'd followed Elias home from a fence check 18 months ago, and no one had tried very hard to send him back, sat at the front of the sled like he was in charge of something, which he may have been. The town watched them go. That was the part Clara had not prepared for. She had thought they would leave quietly, with only Gideon there to see them off. But word moves fast in a small settlement, and by the time they reached the edge of the main track, there were perhaps 15 people standing along the road, not blocking it, just watching. Some of them had the decency to look uncertain. A few looked genuinely worried, and 2 or 3 had that particular look of people who have said something dismissive and are now watching the consequences of their dismissal walk past them with a sled and 2 children and a borrowed dog. Walter Crow was not among them. Either he hadn't heard or he didn't feel the need to watch. Clara suspected the latter. Men like Crow watched events they expected to enjoy. This didn't qualify. Margaret Hensley, who ran the dry goods with her husband and had always been quietly decent to Clara, stepped forward as they passed. She pressed a small bundle into Clara's hands without saying anything. Clara opened it a moment later, once they were past the watching faces, and found 2 tins of beef, a square of hard cheese, and a folded note that said only, "Come back." She tucked it into her coat pocket. The Western Trail began beyond the tree line and was not really a trail at all. It was more the memory of a trail, a suggestion that people had walked or ridden this way before, and the land had not quite forgotten them. The scrub pine crowded close on both sides, and the light was already failing by the time they reached the first marker Elias had left. A cairn of 3 specific stones arranged in a way that looked natural until you knew to look for it. Clara knew to look for it. She had been studying the map for 3 months. "There," she said. Thomas looked. "Those rocks? Your father built that. Probably 4 years ago, maybe 5. He was planning this for a long time. Why didn't he tell us?" "He told me enough." She adjusted her grip on the sled rope. He told me the rest in the way he chose what to leave behind. Thomas thought about this. Then, he trusted you to figure out the parts he didn't explain. Yes. That's a lot to ask. It is. Do you think he knew he was going to... Thomas stopped, started again. Do you think he knew he wasn't going to be here? Clara kept walking. I think he wanted to make sure we were going to be here. That's a different thing. The wind picked up sharply from the northwest, and somewhere above them, in the high branches of the pines, it made a sound that was almost like a voice, but wasn't, low and continuous, and carrying no particular message, except that the mountain didn't care about any of them specifically, and the storm was getting closer with every hour. Ranger moved to the front of the sled and pointed his nose west. Clara followed him. The first hour was manageable. The second hour was difficult. The sled ran well on the frozen ground, but the slope increased gradually, and what had looked like a gentle incline on the map turned out to have opinions about itself. Thomas pulled alongside Clara, and they worked in tandem without discussion, leaning into the rope at the same angle, adjusting for the same rocks and roots. Molly walked beside them and held the lantern, which was not yet lit, but which she kept ready with the striker in her other hand. At the edge of the first ridge, Clara stopped and looked back. Black Hollow Crossing was a handful of lit windows in the gray below. From here it looked very small and very fragile, and Clara felt something that she could not entirely name. Not nostalgia exactly, and not relief at leaving. Something more like the feeling you get when you understand for the first time that the place you thought was the whole world is only a small part of a much larger thing, and the larger thing has been there all along, waiting. Don't look back too long, Molly said. It makes the cold worse. Clara turned forward. Since when do you know that? Papa said it. Thomas pulled on his rope without comment. Clara did the same. They moved. The canyon appeared an hour later, a narrow cut through the limestone where the walls rose 30 feet on either side, and the wind compressed itself into something sharper and more purposeful. The floor of the canyon was frozen solid, and Ranger moved through it with the confidence of an animal who had been here before, which struck Clara as strange, and then struck her as exactly the kind of thing Elias would arrange, if he could have. In the canyon, she found the second marker. Not a cairn this time, a specific groove in the rock face at shoulder height, shaped deliberately. She would have missed it entirely if she hadn't known what kind of mark her husband made when he wanted something to be found. He had a particular way of cutting into stone, an upward stroke followed by a horizontal one that she had seen on the gatepost at home and on the fence marker at the north field line. She put her fingers in it and felt the direction of the cut. Left, she said. The map says right, Thomas said. The map is where he started. The marks are where he finished. She looked at him. He updated the plan. He just couldn't update the paper. Thomas looked at the groove, looked at the map, made a decision that she could see crossing his face like weather, doubt giving way to trust. Left, he agreed. The left branch of the canyon narrowed further and then widened into a small open area that was sheltered from the worst of the wind by the angle of the rock. This was where Ranger stopped walking. He sat down. He looked at the cliff face on the western side of the open area. Clara looked where he was looking. At first there was nothing, just gray limestone, decades of weathering, the specific indifference of rock. Then she looked at the base of the cliff, where a line of white mineral deposit ran horizontal for perhaps 12 feet, too straight to be natural, almost perfectly level, the kind of line that required intention. And above the line, carved so shallowly into the rock that shadow was the only thing that made it visible, were the same notches from the iron marker. Not similar, identical. Molly had been right. It wasn't a key. It was a combination, a sequence. Clara reached into her coat and found the marker through 3 layers of cloth. She held it without unwrapping it yet, just stood there with it in her hand, feeling the weight of it, the weight of everything it had taken to get here. The grief and the cold and the town's indifference and Gideon's worry and the 2 hours of pulling this sled up a slope that had no mercy in it. She thought about Elias working here alone, probably more than once. Probably in the summer, when the light was long and the children were occupied with chores, telling Clara he was checking the fence on the far side. Coming out here instead. Building something in secret, not because he was hiding it from her, but because he was keeping it safe for her. Because he had looked at the future they were building together and understood. somewhere in the part of himself that was more perceptive than hopeful, that the future might need a different kind of foundation than the one they were working toward. He had been afraid. She understood that now. Not in a way that paralyzed him, but in a way that made him build things in secret canyons at the edge of the frontier. The same kind of afraid she had been standing in Walter Crow's trading post, except Elias had converted his into something that could be used. Thomas stood on her left. Molly stood on her right. Ranger sat at her feet and did not move. Clara unwrapped the iron marker. She found the notched edge and matched it against the carved sequence in the rock. 12 inches of cut stone, each notch at a slightly different interval, requiring the marker to be held at a precise angle against the surface. The fit was not perfect. Nothing about this was perfect. Her hands were numb, which made fine adjustment difficult. The angle was awkward. She had to shift her grip twice, and the second time she almost dropped it, and Thomas's hand shot out without a word and steadied hers. She held the marker flat, pressed it into the sequence, felt for the alignment the way a blind person feels for a familiar object in the dark, slowly, with attention, trusting the data of her fingertips over the evidence of her failing eyes in the failing light. Something clicked. Not loud, barely audible over the wind, but definite. The specific sound of a mechanism acknowledging that it has been correctly engaged. And then, slowly, with the grinding reluctance of something that had not moved in a long time and resented being asked, a section of the cliff face shifted. It did not swing open like a door. It moved sideways and slightly inward, like a slab on a pivot, revealing a darkness behind it that smelled of dry stone and cold air, and something else, something warmer and more human, like wood and oil, and the specific smell of a place that had been prepared and then left to wait. Clara stood in the opening and looked into the dark. Her children stood behind her. The storm above them, the one that would, within the next 12 hours, tear apart 2 buildings in Black Hollow Crossing, destroy the Fenwick family's barn, and drive 6 families from their homes into the community hall, was still gathering its worst intentions. But Clara Whitmore was already inside. She reached back without looking. Thomas put the lantern in her hand. Molly put the striker in her other hand. Clara lit the lantern. The light moved forward into the dark like a question, and what it illuminated on the other side of that limestone wall was the answer to a question she hadn't known how to ask out loud, hadn't dared ask out loud, because asking it meant admitting how afraid she had been all along. The space was larger than she expected, much larger, and it was not empty. The lantern light pushed maybe 8 feet into the darkness before it started losing the argument with the shadows, and what Clara could see in those 8 feet was enough to stop her breathing for a moment. Shelves. Wooden shelves built directly into the rock, fitted against the stone wall with the kind of careful carpentry that took time and intention. Not rough frontier shelving, the kind of thing you threw together with whatever boards were handy. These were measured, leveled, the joints were tight. Elias had built furniture like that at home, always apologizing for how long it took, always saying he couldn't put something in the world that wasn't right. She used to tease him that a fence post didn't need dovetail joints. He used to say she wasn't wrong, but he couldn't help it. He hadn't been able to help it here either. She held the lantern higher and moved forward, and Thomas moved with her, and Molly came behind pulling the sled through the entrance, which was wide enough for it if you angled the runners correctly, which Molly figured out by herself without asking. The space opened as they went further in. The ceiling lifted, the walls widened. What had seemed from the entrance like a narrow cut in the rock turned out to be the mouth of something considerably larger, a natural cavity in the limestone that Elias had found, and then improved, and then built inside of until it was no longer just a cave, but something that had a different word for it. Refuge. That was the word that came to Clara's mind and stayed there. The shelves held crates. Some of them were sealed with wax. Some were wrapped in oilskin. A few were open, and she could see inside them. Preserved food in sealed tins, coils of rope, folded canvas, tools wrapped in cloth to keep the rust off. On the far wall, which she reached after perhaps 30 feet of walking, there was a structure she recognized as a heating system. A modified stove design, smaller than their house stove, built from cast iron in sections that must have been brought in piece by piece and assembled here. The flue ran up and to the right at a specific angle, disappearing into a crack in the rock above that was too regular to be entirely natural. Elias had cut a flue channel into the stone. Clara put her hand near the stove opening. Cold, stone cold. But the design was sound. She could see it even in the lantern light, the way the draft would draw upward, the way the intake was protected from backdraft by a simple baffle that he had welded himself. "He made this," Thomas said. He was standing in the middle of the space, turning slowly, looking at everything. His voice was flat in a way that meant he was trying very hard to sound normal. "He made all of this." "Yes." "While we were—" "Yes." Thomas stopped turning. He was facing the back wall where a second lantern hung on a hook beside a folded piece of paper. He crossed to it and took down the paper, held it out to Clara without opening it. It had her name on the front, in Elias's small, careful handwriting. Clara took it. She didn't open it, not yet. She wasn't ready yet, and she had learned the hard way that there was no use forcing readiness. It came when it came, and until then, you worked with what you had. "Start checking the supplies," she said. "Count everything. Thomas, you start with the sealed crates on the left. Molly, check the open ones on the right. I want to know what we have before the temperature drops further." They went to work. Clara went to work. The act of doing something concrete with her hands helped her hold everything else at a manageable distance, which was a trick she had developed sometime in the first month after Elias died and had been using ever since. The inventory took nearly an hour, and what it revealed was staggering in its specificity. Elias had not stocked this place the way you stock a storm cellar. Grab what's available, store what you can, hope for the best. He had stocked it the way an engineer stocked a project. Each category of supply was present in calculated quantities. Dried and preserved food, enough for 6 to 8 weeks for a family of 3 if portioned carefully, which Clara immediately began calculating in her head. Fuel for the stove, stored in sealed metal containers against the far side wall, enough for the same period if used efficiently. Medical supplies in a flat wooden case that opened to reveal bandaging, a small surgical kit, medicines in labeled vials, and a handwritten guide to their use that Clara recognized as being in Elias's hand, but which read like something he had copied from a reference. Careful, precise, more technical than his usual writing. Water. The water was the part that surprised her most. There were large ceramic vessels along one wall, sealed, full. And at the back of the space, in a lower section that required ducking, a narrow channel in the rock floor showed a thin trickle of water moving slowly westward. The filtered limestone water that Thomas had mentioned, the thing Elias had talked about by the fence line. It was not fast, but it was consistent, and it was clean, and Elias had built a small collection basin from cut stone and mortar that gathered it into a pool no bigger than a washtub before channeling the overflow back into the rock. The man had been out here for years, quietly, steadily, making a place for them to survive in, while also repairing fences and fixing gates and doing everything that needed doing, and never once mentioning the full extent of what he was doing with the hours he spent away. Clara felt something complicated move through her that was not simple grief and not simple gratitude. It was both of those things, and something underneath them, something that had to do with the particular loneliness of being loved by someone who shows it in acts rather than words, and not always recognizing it until the acts are all that's left. "Mama," Molly said. Clara turned. Molly was crouched beside an open crate on the right side, holding something up in the lantern light. It was a bound notebook. "There are 5 of them," Molly said. "All the same, all numbered on the spine." Clara crossed to her and took the top one. Number 1. She opened it and found in Elias's handwriting a heading at the top of the first page. Operating Instructions, Black Hollow Refuge, Version 3. Version 3. He had written at least 2 drafts before this one. She turned to the first page of instructions. The language was plain and methodical, not Elias as she had known him in conversation, which was warm and sometimes roundabout, but Elias trying to be clear to someone who would need to act on the information without him there to explain. The stove instructions were first. Startup sequence, fuel ratios, flue adjustment for different wind conditions, what to do if the baffle iced over, what to do if the draft reversed. He had thought of problems she would not have thought of and solved them on paper before they could become crises in reality. She stood there reading with one hand holding the lantern and Molly's shoulder pressing against her hip, warm and solid, and Thomas came over from the left side wall and read over her other shoulder, and none of them said anything for a while. Outside they could hear the storm arriving, Not the sharp crack of it yet. That would come later. This was the advanced sound, the low continuous roar that started in the high country and moved downward through the canyons like something looking for a way in. The limestone walls muffled it significantly. But it was there, and it was getting closer, and Clara closed the notebook and looked at her children. "We need to get the entrance closed," she said. The entrance mechanism worked from the inside with a simple lever system Elias had mounted in the rock. Pull down, the counterweight engaged, the slab shifted back into place. It took 20 seconds and made the same grinding sound as before, and then the roar of the storm dropped another 30%, and the temperature in the space, already a little better than outside, seemed to settle. Thomas noticed the temperature too. "It's warmer in here. The rock holds heat better than wood does," Clara said, though she was reading this from the notebook page she had half memorized in the last 2 minutes, rather than from independent knowledge. "And there's thermal mass from the earth above. Your father calculated it." Thomas looked up at the ceiling, which was solid stone. He calculated the temperature inside a cave. He calculated a lot of things. "When did he sleep?" Clara almost smiled. "I asked him that once. He said he didn't need much." She moved to the stove. "He was lying," but that was the answer he gave. Starting the stove was not as straightforward as the instructions made it sound. The fuel Elias had stored was good, but the ignition system he'd devised, a set of friction strikers built into the stove door itself, had seized slightly from the cold and required 3 attempts before it caught. The first attempt produced a spark and nothing else. The second produced a spark and a brief flame that died immediately. On the third, Clara adjusted the baffle position based on something she'd read in the notebook, and the flame caught and held and began working its way into the fuel chamber with the particular determination of fire when it finally gets enough air. Thomas watched her do all of this. He had offered once, and she had declined, not out of stubbornness, but because she needed to understand the mechanism herself, needed the information to live in her hands and not just in her head. That was how Elias had built things too. You didn't learn something by watching someone else do it. Molly had gone back to the notebooks. She was on number 2 now, which appeared to contain Elias's notes on the water system. "Papa wrote about a filtration problem," she announced, not looking up. "The limestone adds mineral content that's safe but unpleasant tasting. He tried 3 different settling methods and found that running it through packed charcoal from the fire improved it significantly. He stored charcoal in the sealed tin on the 3rd shelf, left side." Thomas looked at his sister. "You read fast." "I read carefully. It's different. Are you going to tell us every single thing in there as you find it?" "Yes," Molly said, with complete reasonableness. The stove, once it was running properly, began to change the air in the space within 15 minutes. Not dramatically. This was not the immediate bone thaw of a roaring fireplace. It was subtler than that, a gradual increase in livability, the temperature rising degree by careful degree until the act of breathing stopped being something that required effort. Clara sat on a flat stone near the stove and finally opened the letter. She had known she was going to read it when the children were occupied and the immediate crisis was managed. She had given herself that boundary as a way of getting through the setup work without stopping, and now the setup work was done, and there was nothing left to do but read what her husband had written to her from whatever point in time he had written it. The handwriting was his, careful and small. The paper was good quality, not frontier paper, not whatever was available. He'd bought good paper for this, which meant he'd thought about it being readable in difficult conditions or after a long time of waiting. "Clara, if you're reading this, you already found the entrance and figured out the marker and got the children here safely, which means you did the hard part before you even opened this letter. So let me skip the part where I tell you you're capable, because you know that, and you always knew it better than you let on." The stove. Notebook. 1. Page 4. The baffle adjustment is critical in high wind conditions. Don't skip it. The water. Charcoal filtration. Sealed tin. 3rd shelf left. Molly will find it if you haven't already. The thing I need to tell you that I couldn't say out loud. I've been sick. Not the way you get sick in winter. The other way. I've known for about a year. Dr. Harmon and Callan Ridge confirmed it last April, which is why I pushed hard to finish the roof section and the water system before summer. I didn't tell you because I wanted to finish it first. I know that was the wrong decision. I know you would have wanted to know. I'm sorry for that specific thing, and I want you to know I'm sorry. What I built here is sound. I checked it 4 times. The heating will hold through any winter this territory can produce. The food stores are calculated for 8 weeks at the portions listed in Notebook 3. The medical kit has everything Dr. Harmon told me to include. Thomas knows more than you think he does. He's going to want to help. Let him. Molly sees things. Let her look. The people in Black Hollow Crossing are not as small as they sometimes act. They're afraid. That's different. Fear makes people small. When the fear goes, some of them will be better than you expect. I love you in ways I was not always good at saying. This place is some of those ways. Elias Clara sat with the letter in her lap for a while. Outside, the storm hit the mountain in full. The sound was different now. Not the advance roar, but the real thing, the accumulated force of several hundred miles of winter coming down from the high country and colliding with solid limestone. Even through 30 feet of rock and a sealed entrance, it was audible, a deep, sustained pressure. The lantern flame tilted slightly in a draft she couldn't identify the source of, then righted itself. Thomas was watching her. She knew without looking. He had that particular stillness that he'd had since he was very small. The stillness of a child who wanted to know if everything was all right, but who had decided not to ask directly because direct questions sometimes got reassuring answers that weren't entirely true. She folded the letter and put it inside her coat, against her chest, where the warmth of her body would keep it. He was sick, she said. He'd been sick for a while. That's why he worked so fast toward the end. Thomas was quiet for a moment. Did he tell you? He told me in the letter. Another moment of quiet. The storm pressed against the mountain. He should have told you sooner. Yes. He was trying to protect us. Yes. That was the wrong call. Yes, Clara said. It was. He said so too. She looked at her son. People who love you can make the wrong call. That doesn't undo the love, and it doesn't make the call right. Both things are true. Thomas looked at the stove for a long time. Then he got up and added fuel to it with the careful, practiced motion of someone who had been watching how to do things correctly and was now, for the first time, doing them himself. Molly looked up from Notebook 2. The filtration system has a secondary issue, she said. Papa noted it on page 11. The charcoal needs to be replaced every 3 to 4 days or the filtration slows. He stored extra charcoal in a second location. She turned a page. He doesn't say where the second location is. It'll be marked, Clara said, getting up from the flat stone. Her knees protested. The cold had settled into them during the entrance work, and the sitting hadn't helped. She stood for a moment until they cooperated, then moved toward the back section where the water channel ran. He marked everything. How do you know? Because your father could not leave something unmarked. It was a compulsion. She crouched near the collection basin and ran her lantern light along the base of the wall. He once labeled every single jar in the root cellar, including the one that just said nails on the outside. I told him we knew what nails looked like. He said the label wasn't for us, it was for future people. Future people, Molly repeated, with the tone of someone filing information. He thought about future people a lot. Clara found the mark. The same upward stroke and horizontal she'd been following since the canyon, cut shallowly into the base of the left wall, pointing toward a section of stone that looked like any other section of stone until you pressed it and found it was actually a fitted panel, not natural rock. Behind the panel, a space roughly the size of a steamer trunk, packed with additional charcoal stores, additional sealed tins, and a small canvas bag that clinked when Clara moved it. She opened the bag. Coins. A folded paper with them. The paper said, "For emergencies I couldn't predict. Use carefully. Tell Thomas I hid them here in case he finds them first. He would spend them on something impractical." Clara put the paper in her pocket and thought about the way Elias Whitmore had known his children with a specificity that was its own kind of quiet love, undemonstrative and entirely accurate. Thomas appeared at her shoulder. "What's in the bag?" "Savings your father set aside." Thomas was quiet. Then, "Is that why we didn't have the money to fix the north fence last spring?" "Probably partly. He could have told us he was saving. He could have told us a number of things." Clara tied the bag closed. "He told us in his own way. His own way required you to follow a map through a blizzard. It required me to trust the map he left. That's different." Thomas took that in without replying, which was his way of acknowledging that she was right, while not quite being ready to agree out loud. He was 12, and 12-year-olds have their dignity. The storm settled into a sustained assault that lasted through the night and into what should have been morning but was indistinguishable from night by any available evidence. The entrance blocked the visible sky, and the temperature outside was producing a cold so complete that even through limestone it registered as a pressure against the skin. Not a chill, but a weight. Inside the refuge, the stove ran. The temperature climbed to something livable. They ate from the stored supplies using the portion guide from Notebook 3, which was careful and specific, and which Molly read aloud while Clara served, because Molly had appointed herself the person who read things aloud, and no one had argued. They slept in shifts for the first several hours, Clara taking the first watch to monitor the stove and the draft, and the half-dozen small things that Elias's notes had flagged as requiring attention in the first night of operation. Somewhere in the middle of what she estimated was the second night, a problem arrived. It announced itself quietly, the way structural problems often do, not with a crash or a visible failure, but with a change in the air, a smell. Faint and wrong, chemical in the way burned metal is chemical, with a slightly sweet undertone that made Clara's eyes water before she understood why. She was awake immediately. She crossed to the stove in the dark and held her hand near the flue connection, and felt what she was afraid she'd feel. Heat radiating not just from the stove body, but from the flue pipe where it entered the rock channel, which meant the draft had reversed or the channel had partially blocked, which meant combustion gases were cycling back into the space instead of drawing upward and out. She shook Thomas's shoulder. "Get up. Don't panic, but get up." He was upright in 4 seconds, which confirmed her existing sense that he never actually fell fully asleep when things were uncertain. "What's wrong?" "Flu problem. Wake your sister." "What kind of bet?" "The kind we fix right now. Wake Molly." She was already at the notebook, lantern lit, finding page 4, the baffle adjustment, the one Elias had specifically flagged for high wind conditions. She had adjusted it once, at startup, but the storm had intensified since then, and apparently the wind was doing something to the air pressure above the flue exit that was working against the draft. Thomas had Molly upright. Molly, who woke from sleep the way she did everything else. With immediate orientation and no visible confusion, looked at Clara and then at the stove and said, "Carbon monoxide." "Probably minor, but yes." "Page 4, Molly said. "I know." "The secondary baffle is the one most people miss. Papa underlined it twice." Clara had the notebook open to page 4. She saw the underline. 2 of them pressed deep into the paper. She found the secondary baffle, a smaller plate inside the primary one that required a specific tool to adjust, which Elias had hung on a small hook on the inside of the stove door, exactly where you'd hang something you wanted someone to find when they opened the door to deal with a problem. The adjustment took 4 minutes. The air in the space took another 10 to clear to the point where Clara's eyes stopped watering. She opened the internal vent channel that Elias had built into the rock, not the main entrance, but a smaller secondary vent, positioned low on the south wall, that allowed fresh air in without allowing the full storm through, and the exchange of air completed the clearance. Thomas sat on the flat stone, slightly pale. Molly sat beside him and opened Notebook 2 again. Clara sat on the other side of Thomas and leaned her head back against the rock wall and breathed the improving air and thought about how many times Elias had thought through this moment, sitting here in his head, running through the scenarios of what could go wrong and building in the solutions before the problems had faces. He thought of that, Thomas said. He thought of everything he could. What if he missed something? Clara looked at the notebooks stacked on the shelf. 5 of them. 300 or more pages of careful, considered planning. "Then we figure it out," she said. "That's what he trained us to do." "He didn't train us. He just—" Thomas stopped. "He left instructions." "Those are the same thing. Instructions are training you do in advance." Thomas was quiet. Then, unexpectedly, "I miss him." "I know. Not the missing where it's always there. I mean the kind where you suddenly miss them all at once because they did something right." Clara put her arm around her son's shoulders. He was 12 and he leaned into it for exactly as long as he needed to, which was longer than he would have admitted to anyone his own age. And then he straightened up and cleared his throat and looked at the stove like the stove required his attention. Molly didn't look up from Notebook 2, but she moved slightly closer to her brother's side. The storm had not finished with them. That much was clear from the sound of it. The sustained, patient violence of it against the mountain, hour after hour, without the kind of break that suggested it was moving on. Clara had lived through bad winters in the territory. She had never heard one sound like this from inside solid rock, which told her something about its actual severity. What she did not know, could not know, from inside the refuge, was what was happening in Black Hollow Crossing. She thought about it anyway. Thought about the small lit windows she had seen from the ridge. Thought about Margaret Hensley pressing a bundle into her hands without words. Thought about Walter Crow, who had not come out to watch them leave. Thought about Gideon Marsh, who had helped with the rigging and said nothing further about whether she was making a mistake, because he was a man who understood the difference between a warning and an obstruction, and had chosen not to obstruct. She hoped the town was managing. She hoped the community hall was holding. She hoped the Fenwick family's animals were somewhere safe. There was nothing she could do about any of it from here, which was a particular kind of helplessness that she had to consciously set down and leave alone. The way you leave a wound alone when touching it only makes it worse. The stove ran through the night without further incident. At some point that felt like early morning, Molly fell asleep sitting up against the wall with Notebook 4 open in her lap, and Thomas carefully lifted the notebook and set it aside and put his own coat over her shoulders with a gentleness that he would have been embarrassed by if he'd thought anyone was watching. Clara was watching. She always watched. She took the first notebook and read through all of it for the second time, slower than the first, making notes in the margins with a stub of pencil she found in the kit. She was looking for things she hadn't caught on the first pass. Things Elias had included that she didn't yet understand. On page 17, in smaller writing than the surrounding text, as if added later, "The shelter is not the point. The shelter is the beginning. What you learn here, about what you actually need to survive, about what matters and what doesn't, about what you can build when no one is telling you what's possible, that's the part that goes with you when you leave. I built this place for the winter. I built it so you could carry the rest." Clara read that 3 times. Then she put the notebook down on her knee and looked at the rock ceiling above her, solid and indifferent and utterly reliable, and felt something settle in her chest that had been unsettled for a very long time. Not peace, exactly. Not resolution. More like the feeling of understanding something you'd sensed was true but hadn't been able to name. The feeling of a word arriving for an experience you'd been carrying without language. She picked the notebook back up, turned to page 18. There was still a great deal to learn, and the storm was still at work on the mountain, and her children were asleep, and the stove was burning, and the water was filtering through packed charcoal in a basin her husband had cut by hand from frontier limestone in the years before he ran out of time. She read on. On the 3rd day, the storm stopped pretending it had limits. Clara knew it from the sound, or rather from the change in sound, the way the sustained roar she had grown almost accustomed to suddenly shifted into something lower and more deliberate, like a voice dropping before it says something it means. The limestone transmitted it differently at that register. Less like noise, more like pressure. Thomas felt it too. He set down the tin cup he'd been drinking from and looked at the ceiling without saying anything, which was his habit when he was processing something he hadn't decided how to name yet. Molly looked up from Notebook 5, which she had reached 2 days ago and was now reading for the second time with a stub of pencil, making small notations in the margins, the same way Clara had done with Notebook 1. "The barometric pressure's changing," she said. "Papa wrote about it on page 32. When the tone of the storm drops by a certain degree, it means the low-pressure system is deepening rather than passing. It can last another 2 to 3 days. "You're reading about weather now," Thomas said. "I'm reading everything." "I can see that." "Someone should." Clara refueled the stove with the measured care she had developed over the past 60 hours. Not generous, not stingy, exactly the fuel load that the notebook specified for sustained low-temperature conditions. She had stopped second-guessing the notebook, not because she trusted it blindly, but because she had tested enough of what it said against what she observed to know that Elias had written it from experience rather than theory. The baffle adjustment had proven it. The charcoal filtration had proven it. The secondary vent had proven it. She had begun to think of the notebooks less as instructions and more as conversations. Elias telling her things he hadn't had the time or the clarity to say out loud, in the medium he was best at, which was building. The problem that arrived on the 3rd day was not one he had written about. It started with Thomas's hands. He had been doing most of the physical work in the refuge, the fuel loading, the water management, the twice-daily check of the entrance mechanism to ensure the weight hadn't frozen in place. Clara had let him take it on partly because he needed the occupation and partly because he was genuinely good at it, better than she would have predicted for a 12-year-old, careful and consistent in a way that surprised her. But on the morning of the third day, he came to her with his right hand extended, palm up, and she saw the problem immediately. The skin between his thumb and forefinger had split, not cut, split. The way skin splits in extreme dryness when it's been worked hard and the cold has taken the moisture out of it completely. The crack was deep enough to bleed, and it had been bleeding quietly for some time before he showed her, which meant it had been hurting for longer than that. "Why didn't you say something?" she asked, already moving toward the medical kit. "It wasn't bad enough to say something. It's bleeding." "I know, but it wasn't. It's hard to explain." He looked at his hand with the expression of someone genuinely puzzled by his own decision-making. "I thought if I just kept working, it would close up on its own." "That is not how skin works." "I know that now." Clara cleaned the crack, which required more effort than it should have because he had not stopped using his hand after it split and the wound had debris in it. He held still through the cleaning in the way that children hold still when they are trying very hard not to show how much something hurts. The stillness of concentrated will rather than the stillness of ease. The medical kit had what she needed, a drawing salve that Elias had included, labeled in his handwriting with the specific indication, "skin splits from cold and dry work." He had thought of this too, not abstractly, specifically. He had known, working out here in the canyon winters, what happened to hands. She applied it and wrapped the hand with a strip of clean cloth from the kit. "You tell me," she said, "when something is wrong, even if you think it's not bad enough. You have other things to worry about. Thomas." She tied off the bandage and looked at him directly. "You are not a problem I'm managing. You are a person I'm responsible for. There's a difference." He looked at the wrapped hand. "Papa used to say something like that." "I know. I heard him say it to you. He was right." She released his hand. "Don't carry things alone just to spare me. It doesn't spare me." Thomas nodded. Then, after a pause, "My left hand is fine." "Good. I can still do the fuel loading." "I know you can." He went back to work, one-handed with the right and two-handed with the left, adapting without being asked to adapt, and Clara watched him do it, and felt the complicated mixture of pride and heartache that was apparently the permanent texture of mothering a child who was becoming capable faster than you were ready for. Molly appeared at Clara's elbow. "I found the problem," she said. "Which one?" "The one with the water temperature." She had notebook 4 open and was pointing to a passage near the bottom of a page. "The collection basin is correct. The charcoal filtration is correct. But there's a third step Papa wrote about that controls the temperature before the water enters the basin. Without it, the water coming through the channel in very low temperatures can partially freeze in the filtration medium and reduce the flow to almost nothing." She looked up. "The flow has been slowing for the past day. I've been measuring it with marks on the basin wall." Clara looked at her. "You've been measuring the water flow with marks on the basin wall?" "Since yesterday morning. I didn't want to say anything until I had enough data points to be certain." She saw Clara's expression and added, slightly defensively, "I was certain by this morning." "That's different from your brother not telling me about his hand." "Completely different. He was hiding a problem. I was gathering information." Molly paused. "Though I understand why you might see a surface similarity. What's the fix?" Molly turned to page 29 of Notebook 4 and showed her. It required accessing a section of the channel upstream from the collection basin, further back in the cave, in the lower section that required ducking. Elias had built a clay and stone collar around the channel at that point that could be adjusted to regulate the temperature of the water passing through by controlling how much of the rock surface it stayed in contact with. Cold rock cooled the water further. The collar could be configured to reduce that contact during the most extreme temperatures, allowing the water to arrive at the basin slightly warmer and pass through the filtration medium without partial freezing. The adjustment itself was simple once you knew about it. Getting to it was the challenge. The lower section of the cave was the part that even Elias's improvements had not fully addressed. Low ceiling, uneven floor, the air noticeably colder than the main space because the stove's influence didn't reach that far back. Clara brought the lantern and went in alone, telling the children to stay by the stove. Molly followed her anyway, because she was Molly. I told you to stay. I know. Molly held up the notebook. You'll need page 29 in front of you and your hands free at the same time. You can't do both. Clara could not argue with this because it was correct. Stay close. Obviously. The collar was where the notebook said it would be, which Clara was no longer surprised by. She worked the adjustment while Molly held the notebook and read the relevant passage by lantern light, and the work itself was straightforward enough except for the cold, which at that depth and that remove from the stove was a serious and immediate thing rather than a background condition. Her fingers stiffened within 2 minutes. She worked through the stiffening, reading from her daughter's reading, adjusting the collar by increments that the notebook specified in finger widths because Elias had written for people working by feel rather than by measurement tools. 3 finger widths counterclockwise from current position, Molly said. I can count. I know, I'm reading it so you can focus on the adjustment. Clara adjusted. The collar moved with some resistance. Clay dried over time, and the mechanism had apparently not been touched since Elias set it initially. She worked it loose carefully, the way you work anything loose that's been frozen in place. Not with force, but with steady, patient pressure that convinces the material rather than demands from it. How will we know it worked? She asked. Molly consulted the page. The flow should visibly increase at the basin within about an hour. An hour is a long time to wonder. Papa wrote, you won't be able to tell immediately if it worked. Wait an hour. If the flow hasn't increased, it's not the collar, and you need to check the filtration medium for ice formation. He wrote it just like that, like he knew someone would want to know immediately. He knew me, Clara said. She finished the adjustment and they went back to the main space, crouching through the low section and then standing straight again in the warmth, both of them moving toward the stove without discussion, the way anything cold moves toward anything warm. Thomas had kept the fuel going in their absence. He had also, apparently, begun reading Notebook 3, which was open on the flat stone beside him, and which he had been marking with his own pencil on one-handed pages because he could not hold the book and write at the same time with the wrapped hand. Ration calculations, he said without looking up. Papa was conservative. We actually have more flexibility than he budgeted for. He was conservative on purpose, Clara said. I know, but it means we're not as close to the edge as I thought we were. He finally looked up. I thought we were closer to the edge. I know you did. I've been eating less than my portion. Clara was quiet for a moment. Since when? Since the first night. I figured if I ate less, you and Molly had more margin. Clara sat down on the flat stone. She was tired in a way that went deeper than sleep could fix, tired in the way that came from sustained alertness over many days, from being the person who had to know what all the moving parts were doing at every moment. She was also, in this moment, looking at her son with an emotion that didn't have a clean name. Not frustration, and not gratitude, and not pride, but something that contained all three and was larger than any of them separately. Thomas. I know. I should have said something. You should have eaten your portion. I know. Your father's ration calculation already included margin for hard physical work and irregular sleep. You've been doing hard physical work and irregular sleep. You need the full amount. He looked at the notebook. It does say that on page 8. Then why? Because knowing something and doing it are different, he said, and his voice had a quality she recognized from Elias. The specific tone of a person who was not being defensive but was genuinely trying to explain the gap between understanding and action, trying to make the irrational comprehensible because they didn't fully understand it themselves. I knew the margin was there. I also knew, I felt, like using it was risky, like it would make us vulnerable. Eating your own food portion is not a vulnerability. I know that now. Clara handed him his evening ration from the supply kit, plus the additional portion he had skipped. He accepted it without further argument, which was its own form of trust. Molly checked the water basin an hour after the collar adjustment. She came back with the report the way she always brought information, directly, without preamble. Flow increased, not fully restored yet, but meaningfully better. By tomorrow morning, it should be normal. Good. Papa's calculation was right. His calculations usually were. Molly sat down cross-legged near the stove with Notebook 5 again. She had a quality of stillness when she was reading that was entirely different from her usual quality of motion, as if all the energy that normally went into noticing the physical world was redirected inward, into the world of the text. Clara watched her and thought about what Elias had written. Molly sees things. Let her look. He had understood both children with a precision that felt, at this distance, almost unfair. Unfair that he had understood them so clearly, and then left before he could do anything with that understanding, left it in notebooks in a limestone cave for Clara to find and apply alone. She picked up Notebook 1 and read past page 17, further into the section she had not yet finished. The later pages shifted in character, less operational, more reflective. Elias writing about why he had built this place, and what he hoped they would take from it, and the things he wished he had said differently, and the things he believed about the people of Black Hollow Crossing, and the territory they all lived in, and the particular kind of strength required to survive, not just weather, but the accumulated weight of other people's low expectations. He had written, "The hardest thing about this country is not the cold. The cold is honest. It tells you exactly what it's going to do, and then it does it. The hard thing is people who have decided in advance what you're capable of. Cold you can prepare for. The other thing you have to outlast." Clara read that sentence 3 times. She had outlasted it. She was outlasting it right now, inside this mountain, in this place that her husband had built in secret while the town of Black Hollow Crossing managed its opinion of both of them. The 4th day brought the first silence. It came in the early hours, the part of night she had been awake for on all 4 nights. She had stopped pretending she was going to sleep through a full shift, and had instead accepted that her body was going to wake her at roughly the same point each night to check the stove and the water and the air quality. But on the 4th night, when she woke at that point, the sound was different. No, the sound was gone. She lay still for 30 seconds, listening to the absence of the storm, which was so complete that it registered as a different kind of pressure. Not the weight of wind against rock, but the weight of stillness, which had its own texture. She got up and went to the entrance mechanism. She did not open it. Not yet. Opening it now, without knowing what was on the other side, was the kind of decision that felt like hope and could easily be a mistake. The temperature might still be catastrophic. The snow accumulation against the entrance might make it impossible to reclose once opened. She stood with her hand on the lever and thought through the variables with the same methodical patience she had been developing over the past 4 days. The patience that came from learning that impulsive action was not the same as competent action. She went back to Notebook 1 and found the section on determining safe exit conditions. Elias had thought about this too. He had built a secondary probe, a thin iron rod mounted in the wall beside the entrance lever, long enough to extend through a small pre-drilled hole in the stone slab to the outside. By holding the rod for 30 seconds, Clara could gauge the outside temperature through the thermal conductivity of the iron. He had included a rough calibration, what different levels of cold felt like in the rod, from tolerable to dangerous. She held the rod. The cold that came through it was serious but not desperate. Not the burning cold of the storm's worst, but a deep, settled cold, the kind that meant the temperature had dropped as low as it was going to go and was now simply waiting. She went back to the flat stone and sat with Notebook 1 until what felt like morning, reading the final section she had been saving, the part that had nothing to do with operational instructions and everything to do with what Elias had been thinking in the last months before he died. He had written about the Western Cliffs with a feeling she recognized as love, not the dramatic kind, but the steady kind, the kind that accumulates through repeated return and close attention. He had described the way the limestone changed color in different lights, the way the filtered water sometimes carried a mineral smell after rain, the way the canyon compressed sound in specific ways that he had never heard anywhere else. He had been going back there for years before he began building, just going there to know it, and the knowing had made the building possible. She understood something then that she had been circling for 4 days without landing on. He had not built this place because he was afraid they would fail without it. He had built it because he had found something in this country that was worth preserving and protecting, something that the fear and the scarcity and the town's small assessments of what they were capable of had no access to. He had been carrying this place in himself long before he built it in stone. She had been doing the same thing. She just hadn't known it was a place until she walked into it. Thomas woke an hour after her and came to sit beside her without being asked. He had his coat on and his wrapped hand held slightly away from his body, the way you hold something you're trying not to jostle. "It's quiet," he said, "since about 2 hours ago. Are we going to open it?" "Not yet. Temperature's still too low." He accepted this without argument. He had gotten better at that over the past 4 days, at accepting the pacing that the situation required rather than the pacing he wanted. 12 was young for that lesson. Some people didn't learn it at 60. "What do you think happened in town?" he asked. "I don't know." "Do you think they're all right?" Clara was honest. "I think some of them had a very hard 4 days. I think the people who were careful beforehand are probably all right. I think the ones who weren't—" She stopped. "I think Gideon made sure as many of them as possible got to safe shelter. That's who he is." "What about Crow?" "What about him?" "Do you think he's all right?" The question surprised her. Not because it was strange, Thomas was not a vindictive child, and the question was genuine, but because she hadn't asked it herself, and now that he had asked it, she found that she had an answer. "Probably," she said. "He's a practical man. Practical men make provisions for themselves." "You're not angry at him." "I'm not angry at him." She looked at her hands. "I was angry at him when he laughed at the map. I was angry at him when I walked out of that trading post. But I've been a little busy since then." Thomas made a sound that was almost a laugh. "He was wrong," she said. "He was wrong about the map, and he was wrong to laugh, and he would have been wrong to give me the wagon if it meant a good outcome because it would have taught him nothing. He needs to sit with having been wrong. That's separate from whether I'm angry about it. Papa used to say that anger and judgment are different things. He was right about that too. He was right about a lot of things. He was wrong about some things too," Clara said. "He should have told me he was sick. He should have told me how far along this place was, so I understood what he was working toward. He kept too much." She paused. "But the things he was right about were the things that mattered most. I'm trying to learn from both." Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then he said something she had not expected. "I want to learn carpentry." She looked at him. "Real carpentry. The kind he used for those shelves." He gestured toward the left wall, where the fitted shelving still held its careful load, each joint tight, the whole structure plumb and level even inside a limestone cave. "I can see where he made each cut. I've been studying them." He looked slightly self-conscious. "I know that's exactly what you should want," Clara said. "I thought you might say it wasn't practical." "It's extremely practical, and it's also more than practical. Both things are true." She looked at the shelves with him. "We'll find you a teacher when we get back. Gideon knows a man in Callan Ridge who does finish work." "You already thought about it." "I thought about a lot of things in the past 4 days." She stood, her knees doing their usual protest that she was increasingly good at ignoring. "I had time." Molly woke when the daylight came, or what would have been daylight, the subtle lightening of the air pressure inside the cave that couldn't be seen but could somehow be felt. She woke oriented, which was her way, and came immediately to where Clara was rereading the iron rod temperature reading. "Better," she said, before Clara spoke. "Better. Not ready." Molly sat down with a piece of paper and a pencil and began writing something that was not in the notebooks. When Clara looked over her shoulder, she found a list, systematic, carefully formatted, with categories and sub-items, of everything they had learned in the past 4 days about the refuge's systems, organized in a way that made it more accessible than Elias's notebooks. A second-generation document, clearer, built on the first. "What is that?" Thomas asked. "Notes," Molly said. "Papa's notes are right there." "Papa's notes were written by one person for a specific situation. Mine are written from what we actually experienced. They're different." She continued writing. "If someone else needs to use this place, they should have a document that includes what we learned, not just what Papa planned." Clara looked at her daughter, thought about what Elias had written. Molly sees things. Let her look. "Keep going," she said. On the afternoon of the 4th day, or what Clara estimated was afternoon, based on the iron rod and the settled feeling of the air, she opened the entrance. The lever moved easier than the first time. The counterweight engaged cleanly. The slab shifted, and the light that came through the opening was the specific blinding white of a world that had been entirely remade by snow, reflecting a thin winter sun that had apparently reappeared in the storm's wake. Cold came in with the light, but it was not the killing cold. It was the honest cold Elias had written about, the cold that told you exactly what it was and did not hide anything. All three of them stood in the entrance and looked out at the canyon. The snow was deep, 4 feet at minimum on the canyon floor, more where the wind had piled it against the walls. The scrub pines were weighted down until their shapes had changed. The world was silent in the particular way of deep snowfall. Every sound absorbed, everything muffled, the whole landscape remade into something that required slow and careful movement. Ranger had been sitting by the entrance since the sound of the storm changed. Now he walked out into the snow up to his chest, turned once, looked back at them, and proceeded to do what dogs do when they have been inside for 4 days, which had the effect of making all three of them laugh simultaneously and without planning to, which was the first time they had all laughed together since before Elias died. It lasted only a few seconds, but it was real. "We need to assess the condition of the entrance path," Clara said, when she could say something practical again. "Whether it's passable, how long it will take to break a trail to the ridge." "I can check," Thomas said. "We check together." She stepped out into the canyon. The snow took her to mid-thigh on the first step, and her breath came out in a cloud, and the cold went straight through her coat, the way cold goes through things when there's no moving air to spread it around, just the dense chill of post-storm stillness. She stood there for a moment. The canyon walls rose around her, the white line of mineral deposit still visible near the base of the cliff, the line that had led her here, that Elias had known would lead her here because he had known how she looked at things, and what she noticed when she was paying attention, and what she would recognize as deliberate when she saw it. The sun hit the upper canyon wall, and the limestone turned a pale gold. Thomas came out behind her and stood at her shoulder. Molly came out behind him, immediately sinking to her waist, which she addressed by climbing back up onto a ledge that put her at a more reasonable relationship to the snow depth. "Passable," Thomas said, assessing the canyon floor with the careful eye of someone who'd been reading about this terrain for 4 days. "Slow, but passable. If we break trail in sections and use the rope as a guideline between anchor points." "Page 12 of Notebook 2, Molly said from the ledge. Papa wrote a winter egress plan, rope anchor points, specific intervals. He marked the spots on the canyon walls. Clara looked at her son. Her son looked at his sister. "Of course he did," Thomas said, but there was no frustration in it now. Just the specific affection of someone who has come to understand a person after not fully understanding them before. They went back inside to pack. The packing took less than an hour, because Elias had organized the supplies for exactly this contingency. The items that went out with them were listed in Notebook 1, page 22, grouped by priority and already in the order they should be loaded. Some of what he had stored would remain in the refuge. That was intentional. "This place is not for one winter," he had written. "Leave it better than you found it." Clara checked the stove. Fuel down to proper low storage levels, baffle adjusted for unmanned operation in low temperature conditions, flue secured, water channel running clear, collar adjusted. Notebooks returned to their place on the shelf. Molly's additional document placed on top, secured with a strip of cloth so it wouldn't shift. At the entrance, Clara looked back one final time. The refuge was not changed by their presence in it. The rock was the rock. The shelves were the shelves. But the air felt different, inhabited, used, understood, as if the place had been waiting to be found and was now, in some way that was not mystical, but was real, complete. She pulled the entrance lever and listened to the slab shift back into place. The mechanism engaged. The click was as definite as it had been the first time. The sound of a thing correctly built acknowledging that it had been correctly used. Clara turned and faced the canyon and the snow and the pale gold of the limestone walls in the winter sun. The road back was going to be hard. The trail would be slow, and the children were tired from 4 days of confined survival, and the temperature was still serious enough to demand attention. The homestead would need assessment when they returned. What the roof had done, what the barn had held, what was salvageable, and what would need to be rebuilt from scratch. Black Hollow Crossing was down there somewhere, below the ridge, in whatever state the storm had left it. Ranger was already moving up the canyon, following the trail he seemed to remember from the way in, breaking a small dog-width path in the snow that was absolutely not sufficient for people, but was optimistic in the direction of progress. Clara followed him. The trail out of the canyon took 3 hours to cover ground that had taken 1 hour going in. That was the arithmetic of deep snow. It didn't just slow you down proportionally, it multiplied every step by its own weight and the weight of the step before it. And the cold that came up through your boots, no matter how well they were made. Clara broke trail at the front, which meant she was the one who hit the unbroken snow first, who sank deepest, who had to lift her legs high enough with each step to clear the surface and then bring them forward through the resistance of it. Thomas spelled her every 15 minutes, insisting on it with a quiet consistency that she accepted because it was correct and because his legs were longer than hers, and the wrapped hand had not slowed him the way she'd feared it would. Molly walked third in line, in the packed trail left by the two of them, and used the time to continue her thinking about the water collar adjustment, or the ration calculations, or whatever it was she was working through in the private processing space that she almost never narrated and very rarely shared until she had reached a conclusion. She had Elias's quality of silence, not absence but direction, thought going somewhere specific even when it was invisible. Ranger ranged ahead and came back and ranged ahead again, covering 3 times the ground they covered while expending what appeared to be the same energy he used at all times, which was the particular injustice of being a dog. At this first anchor point, the mark on the canyon wall that corresponded to the rope guide plan in Notebook 2, Clara stopped to rest and look back at the way they had come. The canyon behind them was still and white and entirely indifferent to them, which was a quality she had come to appreciate about stone. It didn't care what you had been through. It just stood there and kept being what it was, and there was something steadying about that. "How's the hand?" she asked Thomas. "Warm enough." He was breathing hard from the trail breaking but standing straight. "Salve is holding. Let me see it tonight. The bandage will need changing." "You said that this morning." "It will still be true tonight." He almost smiled. The second hour of the return was harder than the first, because the initial effort had taken something from all of them that the rest at the anchor point had only partially restored. Clara's thighs were burning. The cold that had felt manageable at the refuge entrance was now working methodically at every exposed surface. Her face, the inch of wrist between her glove and her sleeve, the spot where her collar had come open and which she had to stop and refasten with fingers that required more instruction from her brain than they should have. Thomas noticed her stop. He didn't say anything. He moved up to the front of the line and took over the trail breaking without being asked, and Clara moved back to the second position and followed him and let herself recover for a stretch without having to pretend she wasn't recovering. Molly came up beside her during a brief flat section where the walking was easier. "When we get back," Molly said, "we need to tell someone about the refuge." Clara looked at her. "What do you mean?" "Not the location, not the entrance, but the principle of it." Molly navigated a drift with the careful footwork of someone who had been paying attention to the terrain for hours. "Papa built it for us." "But what he built, a properly stocked survival shelter with documented systems, that's something other families could do. Not in the same place, but the same idea. That's a large project." "I know, but we learned enough in the past 4 days to explain it to someone." She paused. "You learned enough. I wrote most of it down. The document in the refuge is a start." Clara was quiet for a moment, working through a section where the snow had drifted against the canyon wall and was knee-deep even in the path Thomas had broken. "One thing at a time," she said. "Let's get back first." "I'm not suggesting we do it today." "I know you're not. I'm suggesting it's a reason not to keep all of it secret." Clara understood what Molly was actually saying, understood it in the way mothers understand children who are saying 2 things simultaneously. The surface thing and the thing underneath it. The thing underneath it was, the people in Black Hollow Crossing are also people, and some of them were decent, and what we learned should not stay only with us. Molly had been thinking about this for at least 2 days, Clara suspected. Since the letter, probably. Since Elias's line about the people of Black Hollow Crossing not being as small as they sometimes acted. "We'll see what we come back to," Clara said. That was the most honest answer she could give, because she genuinely did not know. She had been building a picture of what might have happened in town during the storm from the limited information she had, the severity of the sound through limestone, the temperature readings from the iron rod, the duration, and none of those elements assembled into a reassuring image. 4 days of that storm at that temperature would have tested every structure in Black Hollow Crossing. The buildings that had been maintained would be strained, the ones that hadn't been would have suffered. People who had prepared would have been uncomfortable. People who hadn't would have been in serious danger. She thought about the community hall, the largest structure in town, framed with heavier timber than the residences, the one place that could hold most of the population if people consolidated. She thought about whether Walter Crowe had opened his trading post as a shelter, which was large and well built, and whether the decision to do that would have required more generosity than his nature typically produced, or whether fear was sufficient to override nature in a pinch. She thought about Gideon Marsh, who would have been everywhere he needed to be and in none of the places he wasn't needed. She thought about Margaret Hensley's note, "Come back." The ridge appeared at the end of the second hour, and the view from it was the first external information Clara had received in 4 days. She stood at the top and looked down at Black Hollow Crossing and took it in for a full 30 seconds before she tried to interpret it. The town was there. That was the first thing, and it was not a nothing thing. It was a full and solid presence, smoke rising from multiple chimneys, the outlines of the buildings intact in the snow-covered distance. But the shape of it was different. Something large on the south side of the main track was wrong. A footprint of collapsed timber, snow-covered but visible from here as an irregular gap in the regular pattern of structures. And the Fenwick property, which sat on a slight rise east of the main cluster and had been visible from this ridge as a square barn roof and a farmhouse, now showed only the farmhouse. The barn was gone or down. Thomas came up beside her and saw it at the same moment. "The Fenwick barn," he said. "Yes." "Anyone hurt, you think?" "No way to know from here." Clara started down the ridge. "Move carefully. The downslope is going to be ice under the snow." The descent was treacherous in the specific way she had predicted. The snow surface looked consistent, but the ground beneath it had frozen and refrozen during the storm, and the angle of the ridge made each step a negotiation between gravity and purchase. Thomas went first with the rope secured around a scrub pine at the ridge crest, Clara second, Molly last, and they came down in stages rather than a continuous descent, resting the rope anchor at each stable point and resetting it for the next section. Twice, Thomas's feet went out from under him and he caught himself on the rope. Once, Clara slipped and hit her knee against a buried rock and sat in the snow for a moment, absorbing the pain before continuing, because there was nothing useful to do with it except let it settle and keep moving. Ranger, operating under the physics of 4 paws distributed across a larger surface area, descended without difficulty and waited at the bottom with an expression that communicated nothing whatsoever about this differential. They reached the flat ground below the ridge at midday, or what passed for midday in January light, and the walk to the edge of Black Hollow Crossing took another 40 minutes at the slow pace the snow required. But the trail from the town outward had been broken by someone. Hoofprints and bootprints visible under the fresh surface, suggesting that people had been out since the storm ended, assessing, moving, doing what frontier people did after a hard event, which was to immediately begin dealing with the consequences of it. The first person they encountered was a boy of perhaps 14 named Ira Stearns, who was shoveling snow away from a doorway and who stopped when he saw them coming and stared with the particular open-mouthed expression of someone seeing something they had not expected to see. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said. "Ira." Clara kept walking. "Is everyone all right?" He fell into step beside them, still holding the shovel. "Mostly. Fenwick barn came down second night. Mr. Fenwick got the animals out first, so no losses there. The old garret building on the south end collapsed. No one was inside. It had been empty all winter. Community hall held everybody who needed it. Mr. Marsh kept the stoves going." He paused, glancing between Clara and the children with an expression that was trying to figure out how to phrase what he wanted to ask. "We thought, people said you'd gone west before the storm." "We did." "And you just came back." "That's generally what happens when you go somewhere and then return from it." Ira processed this. Then, "Mr. Crowe said you'd never make it." "Mr. Crowe says a number of things." Clara did not slow her pace. "How is his building?" "Fine. It's the best-built structure on the main track. He opened it up second night when the hall got crowded." Another pause. "He didn't want to, but Mr. Marsh told him it was that or the hall roof was going to have problems, so he did." Clara filed this information without comment. The main track of Black Hollow Crossing was both familiar and altered. The buildings were the same buildings, but several of them wore the damage of the storm visibly, a roof section on the chandler's shop that had partially collapsed inward, the loading platform of the grain store with one end buried and broken, window boards on two residences that had given way and been replaced with canvas until glass could be sourced. The street itself was a mixed surface of packed snow and ice and boot prints and the marks of someone dragging timber, which told a story about the past 4 days without requiring narration. People noticed them. Word moved the way it always moved in a small settlement, not announced but somehow pervasive, spreading out from Ira's wide eyes and traveling ahead of them so that by the time Clara reached the center of the main track, there were perhaps a dozen people visible who had not been visible 30 seconds earlier, most of them pausing in whatever they were doing to look. Margaret Hensley came out of the dry goods before Clara reached it. She stopped in front of Clara and looked at her for a moment. At her face and her coat and her children, conducting a rapid inventory of their condition with the eyes of a woman who had spent the past 4 days worrying and was now translating worry into assessment. "You're all right," she said. It was not quite a question. "We're all right." "The children?" "Both fine." Margaret Hensley exhaled through her nose in a way that communicated several days of accumulated tension releasing at once. Then she looked at Thomas's wrapped hand and said, "What happened to the hand?" "Skin split," Thomas said. "Mama fixed it." "Come inside, I'll look at it properly." She was already holding the door. "All of you, come inside and sit down and eat something that wasn't preserved in a tin." Clara started to say they were fine and then reconsidered, because they were fine in the survival sense, but they were also tired and cold, and had been eating portioned preserved food for 4 days. And Margaret Hensley's dry goods had a stove and a back room with chairs and the particular comfort of a space managed by a practical and decent woman who was offering what she had. "Thank you," Clara said. They went in. The back room was warm and cluttered and smelled of cured wood and dried herbs, and the specific domestic smell of a place that had been lived in for years by people who paid attention to their surroundings. Margaret sat Thomas down and examined his hand with competent, unsentimental efficiency, pronounced the salve work adequate, replaced the bandage with clean cloth from her own supply, and added a preparation Clara didn't recognize, a paste she applied over the split before rewrapping, which she described simply as "for the skin," without further elaboration. Molly watched every step of this with her customary focused attention. "What's in the paste?" Molly asked. Margaret glanced at her. "Tallow, pine resin, dried calendula. My mother's recipe." "Does it work better than plain salve?" "In my experience, yes." Margaret tied off the bandage. "You'll want to keep the mixture proportions. 1 part resin to 3 parts tallow, dried calendula crushed fine." Molly was already writing in the margin of the nearest piece of paper she had, which happened to be the page of notes she'd been developing from the refuge notebooks. Clara watched her add Margaret Hensley's hand-paste recipe to the same document that contained Elias's water collar adjustment and the charcoal filtration ratios. Gideon Marsh arrived 20 minutes later, which told Clara he'd been informed the moment she entered town and had come as soon as he could reasonably leave what he was doing, which given the past 4 days was probably considerable. He stood in the doorway of the back room and looked at her with the expression of a man who has been running scenarios in his head for 4 days and is now experiencing the specific relief of the best scenario being the one that turned out to be true. "You found it," he said. "We found it. It was real." Everything he planned was real. She looked at Gideon steadily. "You helped us get there, the rigging work. I fixed some leather, you did the rest. Don't minimize it." He came into the room and sat down heavily in the chair Thomas had vacated. He looked tired in a way that went beyond the last 4 days. The accumulated tiredness of a man who had spent a hard winter keeping as many people upright as he could, while also keeping himself upright, which was a particular kind of exhaustion that didn't resolve with a single night of sleep. "The Fenwick family?" Clara asked. "At the hall. Animals in Crow's back storage. He had space, and Carl Fenwick would have lost 2 milk cows otherwise." He rubbed his face. "The south building going down was the worst of it, structurally. Nobody hurt. Wendell Pike's family had a roof section fail, and they're with us through the week. Otherwise," he shrugged, "manageable. Hard, but manageable." "What about Crow's building?" Gideon looked at her. "What about it?" "Ira told me he opened it up." "He did." Gideon's tone was carefully neutral. "Second night, when the hall was overcrowded and the temperature dropped another 8 degrees, and I told him that his back storage area had 12 feet of height and good insulation, and that using it was the right thing to do. A pause. He required some convincing. But he did it. He did it. Gideon picked up the mug of coffee Margaret had placed in front of him and held it in both hands. He's not a bad man, Clara. He's a man with a very narrow idea of what makes sense. When the evidence forced that idea to expand, he expanded it, reluctantly. He looked at her over the mug. It's not absolution, but it's something. Clara thought about Elias's letter. The people in Black Hollow Crossing are not as small as they sometimes act. They're afraid. That's different. He laughed at the map, she said. I know. In front of a room full of people. I know, and those people watched him do it, and most of them went along with it because that's what people do when someone with standing in a room sets a tone. Gideon set the mug down. And then those same people watched you walk out with your children and a sled in the leading edge of the worst storm in 20 years, and spent 4 days wondering what happened to you. He met her eyes. That wondering did something to some of them. I can't say what, but I watched it happen. Clara was quiet. Outside she could hear the main track, the sounds of people working, the scrape of shovels, the occasional exchange of voices, the ordinary sounds of a settlement getting back on its feet after something that had knocked it sideways. I need to see the homestead, she said, assess what the storm did. I went out yesterday morning. Gideon's voice shifted slightly, just enough that Clara caught it. How bad? He didn't answer immediately, which was its own answer. The roof, she said. The main section held. The addition your husband built 3 years ago? He stopped. The east wall of the addition came in. The roof section over it came down with it. The main house is intact. The addition is going to need to be rebuilt. Clara received this. The addition had been Elias's project the summer before last, a room he'd framed and roofed for Thomas, because Thomas had been sleeping in the main room since he was born, and Elias had decided the boy deserved a space of his own, and had built it over the course of 6 weeks in evenings and weekend mornings, and had been quietly proud of it in the way he was proud of all his building projects, which was to say, without comment, but with a particular attention to the finished details that revealed the pride if you knew where to look. Thomas had gone quiet. Clara looked at him. He was looking at his newly bandaged hand. We'll rebuild it, she said. I know. His voice was even. I know we will. Better than before. He nodded without looking up. Then, I want to help build it. Actually build it, not just carry lumber. You're going to learn carpentry, Clara said. We already decided that. He looked up at that. You said we'd find a teacher. Gideon knows a man in Callan Ridge who does finish work. Gideon, who had been following this exchange with quiet attention, said, Harlan Webb, he trained in Ohio. Good man. I can write to him. Thomas looked at Gideon, then at Clara, with the expression of someone recalibrating what the near future was going to look like. All right, he said, in a tone that tried to be neutral, and did not entirely succeed because there was something underneath it that was not neutral at all, something that was relieved and interested and already leaning forward toward what came next. The knock at the back room door came an hour later. Margaret answered it and returned with an expression that Clara could not immediately read. Not quite discomfort, not quite amusement, something somewhere between the two. It's Walter Crowe, Margaret said. The room went quiet in the way rooms go quiet when a thing that everyone has been thinking about becomes present. Clara stood up. I'll come out front. You don't have to. I know. She was already moving, but I will. Crow was standing in the dry goods front room among the barrels and bolts and hanging tools, wearing his good coat, which was the one he wore when he intended something by his appearance. He was a large man, broad through the shoulders, and he filled the room in a way that had always seemed like authority and now seemed, in Clara's eye, like size and nothing more. He did not speak immediately when she came out. He looked at her in the assessing way he had always looked at her, not the dismissive way he'd used at the trading post, but the careful, calculating way he used when he was trying to determine value accurately. It was a habit from commerce. Everything got evaluated before he decided what it was worth. Clara waited. You came back, he said finally. I did. He cleared his throat. I heard you were gone 4 days. Through the whole of it. Yes. West. West. Another silence. He was working towards something and not arriving at it quickly. Clara had the patience for this, now that she hadn't had on the day she'd walked out of his trading post. 4 days inside a limestone mountain had done things to her relationship with time. "Your husband," Crow said, "he'd been working on something out there. For years. And you knew. I knew enough. Enough to follow a map through a blizzard with 2 children. Enough to trust what he'd built." Crow looked at his hands for a moment. Large hands, rope-scarred, the hands of a man who had done physical work before he had a trading post and who still used them when it was required. "I laughed at the map," he said. "I remember. I didn't—" He stopped, started differently. "I looked at what you showed me and I decided what it was before I thought about it. That's a habit of mine. Deciding before thinking." He did not look entirely comfortable saying this, which was probably the point. People who are comfortable with admissions are not fully accounting for what they're admitting. "It was wrong." Clara looked at him. "It was. Your husband wasn't a fool." "No. I knew that. I still decided the map was foolish." His jaw tightened briefly. "That's not— Those 2 things aren't coherent, I'm aware." "They're not." A long pause. "Is there something you need?" "For the homestead." He said it in the flat, transactional tone of a man who does not know how to offer things without framing them as business. "I have supplies. Timber can be sourced. If the east wall needs rebuilding—" "I'll pay for what I need," Clara said. "I'm not suggesting charity." "Good. Because I'm not accepting it." She held his gaze. "Fair price for fair materials. If you have what I need, I'll buy it. If you don't, I'll find it in Callan Ridge. That's how it should work." Something in his expression shifted. A slight relaxation, almost imperceptible, the look of a man who has been offered a transaction when he expected punishment and does not know whether to be relieved or unsettled by the clarity of it. "Fair enough," he said. He left. Margaret came out from the back room. "You let him off easy," she said. "I didn't let him off anything." Clara turned toward the back. "He has to live with what he did. That's not my responsibility to manage for him." The rest of the afternoon was taken up with the particular practical chaos of return. Gideon arranged for one of the Stearns brothers to bring a horse and sled out to the homestead to carry back what could be retrieved from the addition before the damaged walls became more of a safety issue. Thomas went along and came back with the tools from the addition workshop and the clothing that had been stored in the chest there, and notably, the dovetail chisel set that had been Elias's, which he carried separately from the rest, and set down on the table in Margaret's back room, with the care you use for something that is both a tool and something else. "They were in the bottom of the chest," he said. "Dry. Not damaged." Clara ran her thumb along the handle of the nearest one. Rosewood, worn smooth. Elias's tool marks on the blade from a dozen projects she could not individually name, but whose results she had lived inside for years. "Good," she said. Molly came back from the hall, where she had spent 2 hours talking to the Fenwick family and 3 other families who had sheltered there, and where she had apparently conducted an informal survey of what people had and had not prepared before the storm, which she presented to Clara in the back room that evening as a list organized by category: food stores, fuel, structural preparation, medical supplies. Most families had food for 5 to 7 days, Molly reported. Fuel varied significantly. The families with the least were also the families who had the worst time in the hall because they came in earliest and were most depleted. Medical supplies were almost universally inadequate. Nobody had anything like what Papa put in the kit. "People don't prepare for medical emergencies until they've had one," Clara said. "I know. That's the problem." Molly looked at her list. If someone explained to them what to stock and why, and how much, and what to do with it, the way Papa's notebooks explained the refuge systems, more of them would do it. Clara looked at her daughter. "You're describing a document." "I already started one." Molly turned to the back of her notes. "It needs work, but it's a start." Gideon read it over Molly's shoulder and was quiet for a long moment. "How old are you?" he asked. 9. He straightened. "That's a useful document," he told Clara. "I know. She gets that from her father." "She gets it from both of us," Clara said. "She just combines them differently." The homestead, when Clara walked it at dusk with Gideon, was exactly as he had described. Main structure intact, the addition a partial collapse that was contained and not threatening the primary walls. The barn was standing, the roof sagged on one side but not critically. The fence she had been looking at as a problem before the storm was still a problem, now with the added complications of ice and snow load on the already compromised posts. The north section was going to need replacement in the spring. Elias's workbench in the standing portion of the barn was undisturbed. Clara stood at it for a moment. It was where he had spent weekend mornings, where she had brought him coffee and set it on the corner without speaking, and he had picked it up without looking away from whatever he was doing, and they had existed in the same space in the comfortable silence of two people who had learned that they did not need to fill every moment with words. She picked up the level he had left lying on the bench, held it for a moment, set it back down exactly where it had been. "We can shore up the barn roof this week," Gideon said from the doorway. He had the decency not to come in. "Before the next weather. Timber from Crow? Or from the collapsed addition? Some of those beams are salvageable. Elias used good stock." "He used good stock for everything." Clara turned away from the bench. "Draft me a list of what you think we need. Materials and labor. I'll review it tomorrow, and we'll work out what we can do ourselves and what we need help with." Gideon nodded. "And Gideon." She stopped at the barn door. "What you did, before the storm, with the rigging, and whatever you did during it to keep people together." She did not look for the words too long because the words were not the point. "Thank you." He was quiet for a moment. Elias would have done the same. "I know he would have. He did do the same in his way." She looked at the barn's sagging roofline against the darkening winter sky. "But he's not here. Not here, and you were, and that matters." She walked back to the house. Inside, Thomas had started the stove from the wood that had been stacked before they left. The stack was low but sufficient for the night, and Molly had found the remaining food supplies in the root cellar, which had held perfectly, and was working out a meal from them with the same rational attention she brought to every practical problem. Ranger was already occupying the most comfortable spot on the floor near the stove, with the full-body relaxation of an animal who had completed something significant and was now accepting the appropriate reward. The house was cold, but becoming less cold. The stove ticked and settled as it warmed. The familiar smell of the place, wood and earth, and the specific mineral quality of their well water, was around her. Clara sat down at this table where the map still lay, where she had left it before they went, folded in its same creases. She did not look at the map. She looked at the table, at the marks on it from years of use, the ring from Elias's coffee cup, the knife mark Thomas had made 2 winters ago and been embarrassed about, the uneven surface of the wood where it had swelled and contracted across too many seasons to count. This table, this house, these children moving in the kitchen, Thomas feeding the stove, Molly calculating portions, Ranger repositioning slightly to optimize his contact with the warm floor. She had followed a map through a blizzard and found what was at the end of it. She had kept her children alive inside a mountain for 4 days. She had come back down the ridge and walked into a town that had spent 4 days reconsidering what it thought about her, and she had accepted the reconsideration without performing humility. She didn't feel, and without performing anger, she had sat down somewhere in the canyon. What came next was not going to be simple. The addition needed rebuilding. The north fence needed replacing. The spring planting would require decisions she hadn't yet made. The town of Black Hollow Crossing would continue being itself. Sometimes decent, sometimes small, most of the time somewhere in between, the way people generally were. She would continue being herself in the middle of all of it. That was the thing she had brought back from the mountain that wasn't in any of the notebooks. The notebooks held what Elias had built. What she had built, in the same 4 days, was harder to write down but no less real. A knowledge of her own specific weight, her own specific capability, the exact dimensions of what she could carry and still keep walking. Molly set a bowl on the table in front of her. "Eat," she said, in the same matter-of-fact tone she used for everything. "You've been calculating since we got back, and you haven't stopped moving once." Clara looked at the bowl, then at her daughter. "I haven't been calculating." "You've been doing the thing where you look like you're not doing anything, but your face is very busy." Molly sat down across from her. "Thomas is the same. You both think you look still when you think hard. You don't." "What do I look like?" Molly considered this. "Like Papa," she said, when he was working something out. Clara picked up the spoon. The winter did not release Black Hollow Crossing gently. It let go the way hard things let go. In stages, grudgingly, with one last effort to remind everyone what it had been capable of. 3 weeks after Clara came down from the ridge, a second cold snap arrived, not as sustained as the great storm, but sharp enough to split water barrels left outside and kill 2 of the Fenwick family's chickens that Carl Fenwick had moved back to the partially rebuilt barn too soon. The creek at the edge of town froze solid for 9 days. The road to Collin Ridge became impassable for a week, which meant no mail, no supplies, in or out, and the kind of enforced stillness that either brought people closer together or made them want to take axes to things, depending on their temperament. Clara used the time to rebuild. Not the addition, that waited for materials Thomas had ordered through Gideon's contact, which could not arrive until the road cleared. What she rebuilt in those 3 weeks was harder to see and easier to underestimate. The functioning of the household, the rhythm of daily work without a second adult, the specific recalibration required when you have survived something large, and then have to return to the smaller daily requirements of existence without the adrenaline of emergency to carry you through them. There were mornings when the weight of it sat on her chest before she got out of bed. Not depression exactly. She had seen real depression in a neighbor woman years ago and knew the difference. This was more like gravity. The ordinary gravity of a life that required more from one person than one person was built to give. She got up anyway, which was what you did. But she stopped pretending on those mornings that getting up was easy, and that private honesty with herself was, she found, more sustaining than the performance of being fine would have been. Thomas watched her on those mornings and didn't say anything, which was the correct response, and also evidence of a perceptiveness that continued to outpace his years. He had started a habit of being the first one up, which meant the stove was running and the water was heating before she came out, and he never mentioned it or drew attention to it, just did it the way Elias had done things, as a fact of care rather than a point for acknowledgement. She mentioned it once. Just once. "You don't have to, I know," he said, and went back to what he was doing. She did not mention it again. Molly's document grew. That was the other thing that happened in those 3 weeks, quietly and with increasing structure, in the time between chores and meals and the long evenings when the wind was too cold for any non-essential outdoor work. Molly had started with the refuge notes and the medical supply list she'd assembled from her conversations at the community hall. By the end of the first week back, she had added sections on food preservation, structural winterization for the specific building materials common in the territory, and a condensed version of the stove startup and ventilation principles from Elias's Notebook 1, rewritten in language that did not require the reader to already know what a baffle was. She showed it to Clara on a Tuesday evening, setting the assembled pages on the table with the particular combination of confidence and vulnerability that characterized every significant thing Molly had ever done, certain of the work, uncertain of the reception. Clara read it. She read it carefully, the whole thing, 12 pages in Molly's careful hand, and when she set it down, she looked at her daughter and said, "There are 2 things." Molly had her pencil ready. "What things?" The section on water filtration assumes the reader has access to charcoal, which is not always the case. You should add alternatives. Clara turned to page 7. And here, the ration calculation, you've used your father's figures, which are correct, but they're for a family of 3 doing moderate physical labor. A family doing heavy outdoor work through the winter burns more. The margin should be adjusted. Molly wrote both notes without commenting. Then, "Are those the only 2 things?" "Those are the 2 things that need fixing." Clara pushed the pages back to her. "The rest of it is good. Better than good." Molly looked up. Not for praise exactly. Molly's relationship with approval was pragmatic rather than hungry. She was checking the assessment for accuracy, the way she checked everything. "You think it's useful?" "I think it could prevent several of the problems I've been hearing about since we got back." Clara paused. "Mrs. Hattie Bauer lost her stored vegetables because she didn't know to bank insulation around the root cellar access before the storm. It's on page 4. She wouldn't have had this document before the storm." "No, but she might before the next one." Clara looked at her daughter steadily. "Gideon has relationships in Collin Ridge. There's a printer there." The pencil stopped moving. Molly looked up slowly. "You're talking about printing it." "I'm talking about it being useful to more than the 2 of us." Clara was careful here because Molly did not respond well to having her ideas managed or redirected without her participation in the logic. What do you think? Molly looked at the pages for a long time. Something moved across her face that Clara recognized as the particular internal negotiation between the thing you have created privately and the moment you release it into the world, where you can no longer control what it becomes. Molly, at 9, felt this acutely. She felt most things acutely. She had simply learned to process them at a speed that made it look like she didn't. It needs the 2 corrections first, Molly said. Of course. And a cover page. With a title. That seems right. And it shouldn't have my name on it. Clara looked at her. Why not? Because people will wonder about a 9-year-old writing a survival document, and the wondering will distract from the document. She said it with the flat practicality of someone who had already thought through the social mathematics and arrived at the unfair but accurate answer. They'll take it more seriously if it doesn't have a name, or if it has yours. Clara was quiet for a moment. We'll put both names on it, she said. Clara Whitmore and Molly Whitmore. And we won't explain how old you are. Molly considered this. All right, she said, and went back to the correction notes. The road to Callan Ridge opened in the 3rd week of February, which was later than usual but not the latest anyone could remember. The first wagon through brought the mail that had accumulated, 2 weeks of it, including a letter from Gideon's contact Harlan Webb, who wrote that he was pleased to take on a young apprentice if the boy was serious about finished carpentry and willing to work Saturdays, that being the day he reserved for teaching because his weekday work was contracted and could not be interrupted. Thomas read the letter twice and set it on the table with the deliberate care he used for things that mattered. Saturdays, he said. That's what it says. Every Saturday. That would be the usual meaning of Saturdays, yes. He looked at the letter again. The road to Callan Ridge is 7 miles. I'm aware, I've traveled it. In winter, that's manageable, Clara said, for someone who recently spent 4 days inside a mountain. Thomas made the sound that was almost a laugh. I suppose it is. The lumber for the addition arrived in the same week, brought by a freight wagon from the Callan Ridge yard. White pine framing stock, good and straight, which Clara inspected plank by plank before accepting delivery because Elias had taught her what to look for, and she was not going to rebuild his work in inferior material. The freighter who drove it, a heavy-set man named Durant, who had been hauling to Black Hollow Crossing for 6 years, watched her inspect the lumber with an expression that started as impatience and shifted, over the course of the inspection, into something more like respect. She found 2 warped planks in the second stack and set them aside and told him to credit them against the bill. He did, without argument. Gideon came on the first day of framing and brought with him 2 men from town, brothers named Pickett, who were competent framers, and who Clara had not expected to volunteer their time. She had not asked. Gideon had arranged it, at which he explained without apology when she looked at him. They wanted to do something. I found them something useful to do. I can pay them. They're not looking for pay. Gideon picked up a timber. Let people help when they want to help, Clara. It's good for everyone. She helped when they wanted to help. She also worked alongside them so that she understood every joint in the rebuilt addition, and so that Thomas, who had arrived home from his first Saturday with Harlan Webb, with sawdust in his hair and an expression of concentrated satisfaction that she had not seen on his face since before Elias died, could see how the framing he was learning fit into the larger structure of the building. Webb had him recut the same joint 11 times, Gideon told Clara quietly, while Thomas was talking to the Pickett brothers about something in the framing. 11 times until the fit was right. The boy didn't argue once. He wouldn't. Most boys would. He's not most boys. Gideon looked at Thomas. No, he agreed. He's not. The addition was framed in 3 days. The roofing took 2 more. Clara did the interior finish work herself, in the evenings, with a lantern and Elias's tools, and the specific memory of watching him work that she had been carrying in her hands rather than her head. The knowledge that lived in the angle of the arm and the pressure of the grip and the sound a properly fitted joint made when it closed. It was not perfect. She was not a carpenter of Elias's level and would not pretend to be. But it was sound, and it was done. And when Thomas slept in his room for the first time in the rebuilt space, he said only, "It's good," in the flat, certain tone he used when he meant it completely. Clara took that with her. March came, and with March, the first real softening of the ground. Not thaw, not yet. but the tentative loosening that said the cold was beginning to admit it was losing the argument with the season. The creek unfroze. The road became mud of the specific, reliable kind that meant regular traffic was resuming. Birds returned to the fence posts. It was in the first week of March that Molly's document, titled, in the end, Winter Preparation, a practical guide for frontier families, with both Whitmore names at the bottom, came back from the Callan Ridge printer in a stack of 50 copies that smelled of fresh ink and felt, in Clara's hands, like something that had the weight of a real object rather than just paper. Molly held the first copy for a long moment. "It's different," she said, "when it's printed." "Yes. It looks like something someone wrote, not like something I wrote." "You wrote it," Clara said. "The printing just makes it easier to read." "Someone else is going to read this. A number of people, if we're doing this correctly." Molly turned to page 4. The root cellar insulation section. Read it in the new typeface for a moment, as if reacquainting herself with her own work through unfamiliar clothes. Then she closed it and nodded with the air of someone who has decided to commit to a decision they've already made. They distributed them the following week. Not with ceremony. Clara was not built for ceremony, and Molly actively disliked it. They left copies at the dry goods, at the trading post, at the community hall. Gideon took a bundle for the families he had the most contact with. Clara brought 5 copies to the 3 families who had suffered the worst during the storm: the Fenwicks, the Pikes, and the Bowers. Hattie Bower opened hers at her kitchen table while Clara sat across from her and read page 4, the root cellar section, with the expression of a woman reading instructions that would have been useful 3 months ago, which produced a complicated mixture of recognition and regret that Clara understood well and did not try to fix with words. "I should have known this," Hattie said. "Most people don't, until they need to." "Did you?" "No," Clara said. "My husband did, and he left it where I could find it." She looked at the document on Hattie's table. "Now it's somewhere you can find it too." Word traveled the way word traveled in Black Hollow Crossing, which was to say, faster than anyone formally communicated it, and in more directions than anyone planned. By the end of the second week, Clara had requests for additional copies from 2 families she had not given them to. By the end of March, Gideon told her that the document had apparently made its way to the Callan Ridge area through a freighter who had picked one up at the trading post and shown it to someone he knew. Walter Crow told her about the Callan Ridge interest himself. He came into the dry goods on a Thursday morning while Clara was there ordering spring seed and stood at the counter until Margaret had finished with her and then said, without the extended working up to it that had characterized their February conversation, "Someone in Callan Ridge wants to know if there are more copies available. They asked me because I had one in the post window." Clara looked at him. "You put it in the post window." "It's useful information. People look at the post window." He said it as if this were a straightforward business decision, which it partly was and partly was not, and both of them understood both parts. "How many can the Callan Ridge printer produce?" "As many as someone pays for," Clara said. "I'll pay for a second printing." He said it in the same flat commercial tone he used for all transactions, and then he added, in a slightly different tone, "Consider it an amendment to a previous poor decision." Clara looked at him for a moment. She thought about what it cost a man like Walter Crow to say something like that. Not the words themselves, but the acknowledgement inside them, the small cracking open of an identity that had been organized around never being wrong. "A second printing covers itself," she said. "You'll get the money back in sales." "I know that." A pause. "I'm still paying for the first run." "All right," Clara said. "Thank you." He left. Margaret watched him go and then looked at Clara with an expression that was trying not to be too expressive. "Don't," Clara said. "I didn't say anything." "You were about to." Margaret smiled and said nothing, which was its own kind of saying something. Spring came to Black Hollow Crossing the way it always came to the territory. Not all at once, but in installments, each one slightly more convincing than the last. Until one morning in April, you stepped outside and the air had a quality that was unmistakably forward-looking rather than merely less cold. The ground softened. The mud season arrived and was endured with the stoicism that mud season required. The first green came up in Clara's kitchen garden from seeds she had planted inside in March, and moved out when the temperature allowed, following the sequence in Notebook 3, which had a section on seed timing that she had not read carefully enough the first time through, and which proved accurate to within a few days. Elias had grown tomatoes the same way. She had always thought that was his particular method. It turned out it was the correct method, which he had researched and documented, rather than inventing. She told Thomas this, and he looked at the seedlings for a moment and said, "He read a lot." "He did. I never knew how much. I just thought he knew things." "He knew things because he read things, and then applied them, and then improved on what he read." Clara moved a pot to better light. "That's the complete process. Most people only do part of it." Thomas was quiet. Then, "Webb says the same thing, that most people learn the motion of a craft without learning why the motion works, and then they can't adapt when something changes. Webb sounds like your father. I told him that last Saturday." "What did he say?" Thomas almost smiled. "He said your father must have been a sensible man." The north fence got replaced in April, which had been on the list since before the Great Storm, and which had the particular satisfaction of work that has been deferred too long finally getting done. Thomas did part of it, and Clara did part of it, and Gideon came on the second day for the post setting, which required more hands than two, and which he accomplished with the unhurried competence of someone who had done this work enough times to have opinions about the technique. "Post depth," Gideon said at one point, holding a post in position while Thomas set the tamping bar. 2 feet minimum in this soil. Your father knew that. See how his original posts are still vertical?" Thomas looked at the old section of fence that was still standing. The section Elias had built first, 8 years ago, which the storm had not moved. 2 feet. 2 feet. Most people do 18 inches because it's faster and sufficient in good conditions. Your father did 2 feet because he was thinking about bad conditions. Gideon released the post. "That's the difference between a fence that lasts and a fence that's adequate until it isn't." Thomas set the tamping bar. 2 feet, he said again, with the tone of someone filing information in the place where it would be available when needed. Molly spent April finishing the second document she had been developing since February, not the winter preparation guide, which was its own complete thing, but a follow-on project that had grown from the conversation she'd had during the snow season with the families in Black Hollow Crossing. This one was different in character, less technical, more observational. It was about what people had done well during the storm and what they had wished they'd done differently, drawn from the actual accounts of 16 families, which Molly had collected with a methodical interviewing approach that most of those families had not recognized as an interview because it looked like a 9-year-old being curious about what they had been through. She showed it to Clara in mid-April. "What do you intend to do with this?" Clara asked. "I don't know yet." Molly turned a page. "The patterns are interesting. The families that did best had 2 things in common. They made decisions early, before the storm arrived, and they made those decisions together. Everyone in the household understanding why, not just following instructions." She looked at her mother. "Like us. We had an advantage. Your father prepared us." "Not exactly," Molly said. "He prepared the place. We prepared ourselves. Those are different things." She turned another page. "I think that's what this document is about, actually. The difference between preparation that's done to you and preparation that you understand well enough to carry with you." Clara read the sentence Molly had just spoken and recognized it as something worth writing down. "Put that in the introduction," she said. Molly looked at her with the slightly startled expression of someone who has said something that turned out to be more significant than they realized in the saying of it. Then she picked up her pencil. Summer arrived the way it always did after a hard winter, with an excess of green, as if the land was overcompensating, and with a specific quality of warmth that felt earned rather than given. The homestead was in better condition than it had been the previous summer, not because the storm had improved things, which it had not, but because the work of rebuilding had also been the work of examining what was there and doing it better the second time. The addition Thomas slept in was better framed than Elias's original. The barn roof that Gideon's borrowed labor had reshored was sound in a way the original hadn't been for 2 years. The north fence would outlast the rest of the fence line by a decade. The refuge stayed where it was. This was a decision Clara had made deliberately and without conflict. She went back to it once, in the late spring, alone, leaving the children with Margaret Hensley for the day, and making the trip through the canyon in the full ease of warm weather that made the whole journey feel almost incomprehensibly different from the January version. The slab opened the same way. The space inside was the same space. She checked the systems, adjusted the water collar for summer conditions, per notebook 1 seasonal notes, replenished 2 supply items from what she'd brought. checked that the notebooks and Molly's additional document were in order. She sat on the flat stone near the cold stove for a while and looked at the shelves her husband had built. She had thought, coming back, that she might feel something dramatic. Grief or gratitude, or some resolved version of the thing she had been working through since the January night she first lit the lantern in this space. What she actually felt was quieter than any of those things. The feeling of a place that had served its purpose and remained steady and unchanged, available for the next time it was needed. That was what Elias had built it to be. Not a monument, not even a memory, a resource. She thought about the letter. This place is not the point. The shelter is the beginning. She had read that line perhaps 40 times since the first night, and each time she read it, she understood a slightly different thing by it. Today, sitting in the warm season quiet of the refuge, what she understood was this. He had been right that the place was not the point, but he had been slightly wrong about what the beginning pointed toward. He had thought it pointed toward survival. And it did, but the line from survival to what came after was not a straight line. It moved through understanding, through the specific kind of knowledge that could only come from being tested seriously and discovering that you did not collapse under the test. She had not known what she was capable of until she had to find out. That was the part he could not build in stone and leave in a cave. That was the part you had to get yourself. She closed the entrance on the way out and stood in the canyon for a moment in the summer light, the same pale gold on the limestone walls that she had seen in January against the white of the snow. The mineral line was still there at the base of the cliff, still too straight to be natural, still the specific evidence of Elias Whitmore having known that the things you build with intention look different from the things that simply happen. She walked back down through the canyon and through the scrub pine and over the ridge in the warmth of a June afternoon, and by the time she reached the flat ground below the ridge, she had made a decision she had been approaching for several months without quite arriving at it. She told the children that evening. "I'm going to talk to Gideon about a meeting," she said. "Not a town meeting, nothing formal, just the families who were worst hit by the storm and a few others. I want to talk about what Molly wrote." She looked at Molly, both documents, and what we think should happen next. Thomas looked up from the boot he was mending. He had taken up boot mending in addition to carpentry, on the grounds that one income in an uncertain country was not enough and leatherwork was practical. "What do you mean? What should happen next?" "The documents tell people what to prepare. That's the first thing. But a family can't prepare everything alone. Some things, the kind of large-scale shelter capability that your father built, those require more resources than one household can gather." Clara folded her hands on the table. "There are places in this territory that a prepared community could use. Caves that could be improved, natural shelters that could be stocked. The same principles your father applied, but on a scale that more families could benefit from." Molly's pencil was already out. Thomas set down the boot. He was looking at his mother with the expression he used when he was recalibrating, when reality had expanded slightly beyond his previous estimate of it. "You're talking about using the refuge as a model. The refuge stays where it is and stays what it is. That's not negotiable." Clara was clear on this. But the idea of it, the principle, the documentation approach, those belong to everyone. "The document is already out," Molly said. "That's already happened. The document is the first step." Clara looked at both of them. "What I'm talking about is the next one." The meeting happened on a Saturday in late June in the back of the community hall, which was large enough and which Gideon had arranged without requiring explanation because he was Gideon and he understood the shape of what Clara was trying to do before she had finished describing it. 14 people came. Clara had expected 8 or 9. 14 people meant that word had traveled further than she'd managed it. That the meeting had the kind of pull that came from people already thinking about something and then discovering there was a place to think about it together. Walter Crowe came. She had not expected that. He sat near the door, which was either the habit of a man who liked to leave easily or the habit of a man who was not sure he belonged there and was keeping his options open. Clara chose to read it as the second and to act accordingly, acknowledging him when she opened the meeting with the same neutral recognition she gave everyone, not more and not less. She spoke for 20 minutes, not about the great storm or the refuge specifically, or anything that required people to understand what she had been through before they could engage with what she was proposing. She spoke about the gap between what individual families could prepare and what a community could prepare, if the preparation was organized and the resources were pooled. She spoke about the specific vulnerabilities she had identified from Molly's second document, the patterns across 16 families, the two common factors of the families that had managed best. She spoke about the kind of shelters that existed naturally in the limestone territory west of Black Hollow Crossing, and what it would take to assess and improve them. Then she asked if anyone had questions or disagreed with what she'd said. Hattie Bauer said, "My husband would need to understand the cost before he'd commit to anything." "That's reasonable," Clara said. "I don't have cost figures yet because I don't have a plan yet. This is the step before the plan." A man named Sorensen, whom Clara knew slightly, said he was not sure the territory government would approve of families improving public land without permits. "That's a real question," Clara said. "Gideon has contacts in the county office. We can find out what the process requires." Walter Crowe said nothing for the first half of the meeting. Then, in the middle of a back and forth between Clara and the Fenwick family about the logistics of stocking a shared shelter, he said, "The location assessment is the first problem. You need someone who can read terrain and identify what's structurally viable before you spend money on anything else." A pause. "I know a man in Callan Ridge who did survey work. He'd give an honest report." The room was quiet for a moment in the specific way of a room absorbing a surprise. "Thank you," Clara said. "That would be useful." Crowe nodded and went back to looking at the door. Gideon, who was sitting beside Clara, did not look at her, but she saw the slight adjustment in his posture that meant he had noticed something and filed it. The meeting lasted 2 hours and produced 3 concrete things: a list of the families who were willing to participate in further conversations, a commitment from Gideon to pursue the permitting question, and a volunteer group of 4 men who would do an initial terrain assessment west of town with the surveyor Crowe recommended. It was not a plan. It was the beginning of a plan. Clara understood the difference and was not impatient with it. The beginning of a plan was where Elias had been when he first walked into the Western Canyon with a notebook and an idea, years before the shelter existed, in anything but the possibility space of his intention. Every structure started there. Every structure started with someone who could see the finished thing well enough to begin. The meeting broke up in the long summer evening light, people dispersing in pairs and small groups, conversations continuing onto the street in the way of conversations that have not finished with their subject, even when the formal occasion for them has ended. Molly walked out with Clara and stood beside her on the step, looking at the main track, where Ranger was conducting an investigation of something in the shadow of the grain store with the focused interest of a dog who had committed to a theory. "Was that what you wanted to happen?" Molly asked. "It was what I hoped might happen," Clara said. "Those aren't the same." "What's the difference?" "What you want, you expect. What you hope, you work toward without being certain of." She watched Ranger abandon his investigation and sit down in the dirt with the air of a case satisfactorily concluded. "Hope is better, most of the time. It leaves more room for other people to contribute things you didn't expect." Molly thought about this. Like Crowe and the surveyor. "I didn't expect that." "Was it useful?" "If the surveyor is good, yes. If Crowe continues to show up, not just for meetings, but for the actual work of it, then also yes." Clara stepped down from the step. "We'll see." Thomas caught up with them halfway down the track, coming from the direction of the Pickett house, where he'd been working a half day on some repair project that Dan Pickett had needed an extra pair of hands for. He had sawdust in his collar and the specific alertness of someone who had been doing physical work and was still slightly elevated from it. "How was the meeting?" he asked. 14 people, Clara said. "That's more than you thought." "Yes." He walked with them toward the homestead, Ranger appearing from somewhere and joining the procession with the air of a dog who had always been intending to go this direction. The light was long and gold in the way of summer evenings in the territory. Everything softened at the edges, the scrub pine on the ridgeline in the west catching the last angle of sun. Thomas said, "Webb asked me what I wanted to build someday, not for practice, for real." "What did you say?" He was quiet for a moment. "I said I didn't know yet, but that I wanted to build things that lasted." He looked at the ridge. He said that was a good answer because it meant I was thinking about material and method, not just outcome. He's right. He usually is. Thomas put his hands in his pockets. "I think I want to build furniture someday, the kind that gets passed down." He glanced at Clara, slightly self-conscious. Is that impractical? It's the opposite of impractical, Clara said. It's the most practical thing there is, building something that lasts past your own time. He nodded and said nothing further, but the line of his shoulders changed slightly. The particular shift of a person who has been carrying a quiet uncertainty and has set it down. That was the summer, the work of summer. What Clara understood, standing at the kitchen window in the early morning before either child was up, looking out at the homestead that was in better condition than it had been when Elias was alive and caring for it. What she understood was something she did not think she could have understood a year ago, or even 6 months ago. She had spent the months since January waiting, somewhere underneath all the doing, for things to return to the way they were, for the shape of life to reassemble into the shape she had known before Elias died. That waiting was so quiet and so constant that she had not identified it as waiting. It had felt like grief, like adjustment, like the ordinary difficulty of hard circumstances. But it was also waiting. At some point in the winter, inside the mountain, the waiting had stopped. Not because she had stopped grieving, or because the loss had become smaller. It had not. Elias Whitmore had been the person she built her life with, and his absence was a permanent feature of the landscape now. Something she navigated around every day, the way you navigate around a large stone in a familiar field. You know it's there. You adjust for it. You stop noticing the adjustment without the stone becoming smaller. The waiting had stopped because she had understood, in the particular clarity that comes from an emergency that strips everything down to what is actually required, that the life she was living was not a damaged version of the life she was supposed to be living. It was the life she was living, the one she was building, with her own decisions and her children's growing competence and the unexpected decency of some of the people around her and the honest inadequacy of others. She had not come back from the mountain to resume something. She had come back from the mountain with something. The map was still on the table. She had not moved it. She kept thinking she would put it somewhere appropriate, framed, maybe, or tucked safely in the journal with Elias's survey notes. But every time she thought about moving it, she left it where it was instead. One morning in August, Thomas came in from an early chore and looked at the map on the table and said, "Why do we still keep it there?" Clara poured coffee. "Because I like to see it. It served its purpose." "Yes. So what?" "Because it reminds me that he was thinking ahead," she said. "Even when I couldn't see what he was thinking toward, he was always thinking ahead." She set down the pot. "That's something I want to remember." Thomas looked at the map for a moment. Then he sat down and pulled it toward him and looked at it the way he had that first night, with the careful attention of someone reading a document. "The western cliffs," he said, "the canyon entrance." He marked the anchor points for the rope guide, too. He marked everything. He marked things for someone who wasn't him. Thomas set the map down. He wrote instructions for people who didn't have his knowledge. He didn't assume they'd figure it out. He knew he wasn't always going to be there to explain it. "I want to do that," Thomas said. "When I build things, leave them in a way that the next person can understand what I did and why." He looked at his wrapped hand, which was healed now, but which he still carried with a slight protective awareness. "Not to be remembered, just so the work keeps going." Clara sat down across from him. There were things she could have said in that moment, about Elias, about legacy, about the particular kind of love that expresses itself as preparation. She had thought about all of those things many times in the past months and had arrived at various formulations that felt, in her head, like they might be true. She did not say any of them. She picked up her coffee and looked at her son across the kitchen table in the morning light and let the moment be what it was. A boy of 12 sitting in his father's chair without knowing he was sitting in his father's chair, talking about what he wanted to build in a life that was going to be longer and stranger and more difficult and more full than either of them could see from here. "Good," she said. It was enough. Years later, when the people of Black Hollow Crossing talked about Clara Whitmore, and they did talk about her in the way that small communities carry their significant figures forward, the stories getting simplified with each retelling until they become something closer to legend than to truth. They said she was the woman who had survived the Great Storm of 1887 by following her husband's map into the Western Mountains. They said she was the woman who had come back. What they did not usually say, because it was harder to make into a story, and because she herself had never told it as a story, was what she had actually done in the months and years that followed. The document that Molly Whitmore had written at 9 years old, and which Clara Whitmore had taken to a printer and distributed through a trading post, and which had eventually found its way to county offices and been incorporated into the preparedness guidance that went out to frontier families in 3 territories. The network of assessed and stocked shelters in the limestone country west of town that had, over the following decade, provided safe refuge during 2 additional hard winters for a total of 9 families who otherwise might not have made it through. The quiet insistence, maintained without drama across years of town meetings and informal conversations, and the persistent friction of other people's inertia, that preparation was not an individual virtue but a community practice. That the people who survived hard things were rarely the ones who had been strongest alone, but were more often the ones who had understood that strength was most useful when it was shared. Walter Crow's surveyor turned out to be competent and honest, and the assessment he provided became the foundation of the shelter network, which was a fact that Crow himself never mentioned and that Clara never mentioned to him, the 2 of them having arrived at a kind of working relationship built entirely on the present tense and the pragmatic question of what needed doing and who could help do it. Gideon Marsh helped with the permits and the county contacts and the dozen logistical problems that turned an idea into an actual physical reality. And when Clara told him once that she could not have done it without him, he said, "You would have found another way," which was probably true, and which was also not the point, and which both of them understood in the specific way of people who have been through something significant together and do not need to be precise about their meaning. Thomas Whitmore became a carpenter of some reputation in the Callan Ridge area, known for the particular precision of his joinery and for the habit, which his clients either loved or found mildly unusual, of leaving a small set of notes with every piece he built: materials used, techniques applied, what to do if a specific joint began to loosen, how to identify problems early. Harlan Webb, who was not a sentimental man, told him when he finished his apprenticeship that he was the best student he had taught, and Thomas thanked him and went home and told his mother, who said, "I know," which was the correct response and exactly the one he had expected. Molly Whitmore's second document was never formally published, but it was copied and shared widely enough that its central argument, that community preparation required shared understanding, not just shared resources, became a recognizable idea in the territory's practical literature, attributed to nobody in particular, the way useful ideas often end up belonging to everyone. She was 9 when she wrote it. She was 10 when it started moving on its own. Clara Whitmore lived in the homestead at the edge of the long, flat field for the rest of her long life, which turned out to be considerably longer than anyone in Black Hollow Crossing would have predicted for a young widow in the winter of 1887. She kept Elias's notebooks on a shelf where she could reach them easily and read sections of them occasionally, not for the information, which she had long since internalized, but for the handwriting, which was still careful and small and entirely unlike the man who had taken up so much space in a room. The map stayed on the table. She was asked about it sometimes, what it was, where it led, why she kept it out. She gave different answers at different times, depending on who was asking and what they seemed to be asking underneath the question.